First of all, we're going to release this, right? So let's give anybody who chooses to listen a little bit of context, is that we just have fun talking. So we decided that we would do a different version of a podcast off of the Unscripted Room called Mic Check, which is just, we do our Unscripted Room podcast every Wednesday and Thursday night. And so it's Tuesday midday, and we're thinking we'll use this time slot every week to be able to both do a mic check and just talk a little bit more freely about any topic that we want to, which is different than what we're doing in the Unscripted Room, which has a little bit more guardrails to the way that we're trying to frame those conversations. So I'm just curious today, like what are the thoughts that you're having lately? What are the things that are coming up for you as we go through this whole process?
Well, I know one of the things that came up for us earlier today in our conversation was the sort of equalizing power of AI in terms of creating the ability for people to create products, businesses, services, and that it's kind of equalizing the playing field in terms of financial investment, skill, and making it, creating an environment where creativity might just end up being, and perhaps already is, the most important determining factor as to whether you're able to make something that's amazing. That's certainly a thread I think that is something that's been on my mind recently, and other sort of things trying to pick up the. There's a word that comes up a lot recently. I don't know why it's been popularized exactly, but it's a German word which means zeitgeist, or it is zeitgeist, and it means something like the spirit of the times. And so I'm always trying to think about what is that, and I think there's a few things that come to mind, which is like automation. I think everyone's obsessed recently with trying to automate, trying to optimize, trying to make everything as little effort as possible. With all the new tools that we have, I know that's something that I try and do, whether it's with Apple scripts or new AI tools that are coming out. But I think that yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see over the next X amount of years the way that all of those things actually affect the world and the way that we live.
Every night before I go to bed, as part of like my sleep hygiene, I've been listening to Carl Jung's autobiography.
Yeah, you mentioned that, I think.
Are you familiar with him at all? Do you know?
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because he talks a lot about his relationship with Freud and like what have been the sort of logical developments that have happened over generations of the way that we perceive ourselves and the way that a mind works, the way that the mind works. But, I've really enjoyed listening to him because he just seems like the way that he describes everything strikes me as being very, very honest. He is not he's not pursuing something with his ego. He's trying to figure out what the truth is.
Yeah.
And you could kind of feel that in the language that he uses in his autobiography. He's never so self-assured about anything that makes you think that he is observing it from a place of authority, I guess, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was just going to say, I think one of the things that came up in the original sort of mic check series the first mic check that we did was how historians always sound so confident when they tell you about things that happened 8 million, 5,000, 3,500 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, even in this book, right? So we're talking about, I think his lifespan bridged the late 1800s into let's say 1930s or 40s was sort of his prominence of where his career was building and where he had some level of influence. And it's very clear when you listen to it, that he was living through an age where society was starting to kind of back away from spiritual realities and starting to lean into scientific reality.
Yeah.
And that also seemed to be a massive spark in the building of technology. Because technology seems like it's like you could never I heard Joe Rogan say this the other day. He was describing the way that they build those microchips,
Hmm.
and they were showing a picture of the machine that builds it, and the machine is so precise and it does stuff at
Oh, I know
s-
exactly what you're talking about. Yeah,
it,
I've watched. Yeah,
like unimaginable, right? It's
yeah,
like
yeah.
eh,
They have mirrors
yeah,
in those machines that are like the smoothest surface in the world, and they bounce. What is it? They shoot a laser at a piece of at a small piece of some kind of metal, and it turns into like a plasma that
yes.
bounces off like 30 mirrors, and then hit like carves into these tiny little chips. It's pretty crazy.
And it looks like it. I mean, they gave a description too where it was like it has to essentially shoot these things like they're
Hmm.
targets, but they're microscopic essentially, and the level of accuracy has to be at 100%.
Yep.
And it's at 100%. And so when they're done making these chips, the quality of the chips apparently is like some might be at 100 and some might be at 72%.
Yeah.
So the hundreds get sold as like the high end chips, and the 70% get sold as the lower end chips, which also made me think about the process that we go through with clipping an episode. It's
Right.
kind of
Yeah,
funny in that
right.
same
No,
way.
totally.
But the thing that I was thinking, Oliver, that I thought would be fun to explore with you, because I know I just always enjoy these conversations with you, is this idea that, the, you know, there may have just been a major shift from having our minds like with a deeper exploration of our spiritual selves. And then when we shifted over and we started really focusing on the physical world
Hmm.
and our bodies and the science behind that, we started to very, very quickly create all kinds of technologies that were a reflection of us.
Yeah.
So like a machine, especially an internal combustion engine, essentially works the same way your body does, right? It requires air and fuel,
Mm.
mixes those two things together, turns it into power, and then depending on the shape and the size, and it demands how much leverage you have or how much torque you can create with whatever it is that you're using.
Yeah.
But a machine is essentially a version of the way that we work in different
Yeah.
ways.
Well, there's a couple interesting threads there to pull, which is the first one that I want to go to because I think it's the most related is just this idea. There's a very classic saying about significantly advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, um, and I think that there's a new way that that's becoming true, and it's the ultimate reflection of ourselves, right? Because there's an example of magic in some Tolkien, which I'm a huge Tolkien sort of fan, which I don't even know if that's come out in our conversations yet. But
I don't think so.
um,
I don't know much about Tolkien, but
oh, he's a genius.
I'll fan out with you if you want.
Yeah.
Try.
Well, so magic in his world is kind of interesting because that's that that would be a whole nother thing. But the example is that they have this piece of rope. The main characters in the Lord of the Rings, Sam and Frodo, have this piece of rope that was given to them by the elves. And the elves don't really think that things are magical. They just think that they're well made. And the understanding of magic is kind of like a misunderstanding of humans, and in this case, hobbits. And they use this word magic, and the elves don't know what it means. They're like, we make things, and those things work well. And one of the things is that they have this rope that's given to them by the elves, and they're using it they tie it at the top of this cliff, and they use it to sort of belay themselves down. And then at the end, they're like, "Oh, it's a shame we don't have that rope anymore." Um, and then Sam sort of is like, "Yeah, no, that you couldn't get this rope down if you tried. Like the knot that I tied at the top is very secure." And he gives the rope a tug to demonstrate that, and the rope unties itself and comes down perfectly. And I think that the really interesting thing about that is that essentially what has happened is that the rope has been imbued with a kind of intelligence, right? Where it knows at this time I'm supposed to remain tied, and at this other time I have context that tells me that that's not the case, and I'll untie myself. And I think that when you look at a lot of quote unquote magical items, that this is actually the case. That what we're seeing is an item that's imbued with intelligence.
Mhm.
And now with the technology that we have, we've been able to recreate the perception of context and the ability to make decisions basically by digitally recreating to the best of our ability what a brain does. And so that's like the ultimate. I think we're going to move into an age that, like no other before, could be looked on from people of the past, and they would really think like this is magic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's been many technologies before that we already have that seem quite magical, but this is, I think, an interesting way to think about magic as being something that has a mind of its own.
I think that's it's an interesting way to think about it. The thing that I was thinking about this morning, Oliver, is that I got up early this morning and I listened to a podcast, and the podcast was basically giving an overview of what is happening in the Middle East right now.
Hmm.
And I think we're about to enter an era of prosperity that is going to be amazing for humanity because of the reasons that we talk about. Because I think ultimately AI can be a tool to be able to get closer to an equality of opportunity than humanity has ever had.
Yeah.
That we start to get more and more structurally prepared to make sure that we don't believe that one person is more valuable than another. But we shouldn't be ignorant right now on how dangerous this technology can be in the hands of someone who wants to make war.
Oh yeah.
Because it is getting a little frightening. And we have to be careful because at some point, no matter how, even if there were 98% of the population who by all means would prefer peace over war,
yeah.
2% of people in power could make everybody feel like they don't have a choice. And I'm pretty concerned about that based on what I heard this morning. It didn't sound very good.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I think is going to be a game changer that doesn't necessarily even the playing field, although it might. It's kind of a complicated conversation. Is once we get into the humanoid robots, and I don't think that it's entirely been that the public attention has entirely been drawn to the fact that right now in the U.S. You can buy these things like for less than $15,000. You can buy a humanoid robot. You could probably do that. You know what I mean? Like if you wanted to, you could have one. And it can do some pretty incredible things. There's obviously much more expensive ones as well that are into like the 200,000, maybe more. But there's a couple companies that offer humanoid robots that can do things like watch you do something and then repeat it back to you, and do basic household tasks and things like that for less than $15,000 is the last thing that I saw, which is really interesting because on the one hand, the more money that you have, you can buy, an astounding amount of power with, purchasing labor. But then the other really interesting thing about it is that, if you are even an individual, right, who's extremely, or not even extremely wealthy, if you're an individual who can cough up, enough money to buy some of these things and whatever it takes to power them, then you can send your fleet of, 2 or 3 or 10 or more humanoid robots over to foreign countries to provide relief to people who don't have resources, or, build your own robot, relief foundation or farming organization or whatever it is. So the power of an individual, if it's like the price of labor essentially will go down, which can be used for good or bad. And will enable, I think, more people to be able to have quote unquote employees. But then incredibly powerful people will also have the ability to have a ridiculous amount of employees.
So that's the thing that I think that's what I would be really curious to talk more about, Oliver, is that I've avoided watching the news for a really long time. And I've actually found that the more I've done that, the more I have a deeper desire to try to not even, not watch television, not watch anything that's not like intentional art.
Yeah.
a movie that you really love or a television show that's really good. Those seem like if you're not watching commercials, you get to jump into them and you
Mhm.
feel like you can stay connected. But I think that what's happening is that we're all having conversations that are at the surface of what we believe could happen,
Yeah.
but we're ignoring the depth of where we're really always going to, find the problem, which is why do people want to hurt each other? You know what I mean? Like, what is it? What is it that is causing someone to feel like they want someone else to live a terrible life when there clearly is plenty of opportunity for everybody to be able to live their best life?
One of the interesting things that came up in language and thinking, the last episode of the Unscripted room that we did, was this idea of, people who are raised in an environment of scarcity and have a hard time letting go of the the pattern of having to compete for resources, uh, which often comes with, being an environment that's not filled with trustworthy people, and so having a hard time trusting. But then on the other side of that is interesting because it almost seems like I'm used to the people who are the most Machiavellian being those who actually do have resources, and maybe they came from an environment of scarcity, but it doesn't seems like most people who are really in a position of wealth and power, um, their families have been making that journey, over several generations. Um,
Well, can we let's break it down, and let's try to go as deep with it as we can. But in my view, Oliver, like the people, if you have wealth and power right now,
mm,
and you are still trying to keep your heel at people's throat, then you're also operating off of a scarcity model. You're just scared that those people won't actually want you to lead them.
right.
And so instead of doing doing what's necessary for people to feel inspired by you to do the next thing, um, they're using fear tactics to be able to keep people frantic. And part of that frantic is hoarding wealth so that some people have a tremendous amount of it and other people feel like they can't do better than day by day thinking
Yeah.
because they don't know, they don't, some people don't know when their next meal is going to come, never mind whether they can pay their mortgage. But paying your mortgage is also just another version of knowing where your next meal is going to come from.
Yeah.
It's just maybe not as intense. It's that same, your nervous system still feels out of whack when you have those thoughts of like, oh man, do I have enough in my bank account right now to be able to survive something that doesn't go right?
Hmm.
That is probably hitting the exact same part of your nervous system, which is like, oh man, am I going to be able to feed my kids tonight? It's just feeding your kids is at 10 and paying your mortgage might be at a 4 or 5 or 6, depending on. But I think that it's just a human pattern that we're seeing played out. And it strikes me that if you stay, the problem with staying in a scarcity mindset is that it makes you incredibly manipulable,
Mm,
right? Because if you are constantly thinking like there's not enough for everyone, which also means that there's not enough for you, then all somebody has to do is continue to put you in a position where you barely have enough.
right.
And they'll know that they can pretty much control your behavior from there.
Yeah. One of the things that I've heard you say before that rang true for me was this idea that all of the behaviors that we would categorize as sort of like negative or bad behaviors or antisocial behaviors um, stem from insecurity. And I think that one of the interesting places you can go with that thought is that there's sort of like physical insecurity, real insecurity, and then there's sort of like mental, imaginary insecurity, right? Where if you have food insecurity, this is, makes a lot of sense that you might end up making a decision to lie or steal or manipulate, right? Um, but if you have a mental insecurity, it doesn't matter how many resources you have. If the insecurity that you have is more based around, I need people to look up to me, respect me, fear me, whatever it is, right? That ultimately that is the same, right? It's like you're saying, it's a perceived scarcity, and maybe perceived scarcity or scarcity and insecurity and are sort of like connected in that way, where you think that there's whatever it is, right? If it's real or an imaginary, if it's a mental currency or a physical one, you are perceiving that you don't have enough, and so
Right.
you need to take actions that you know are not truly going to be, that are not what you should be doing, because you need to get enough of whatever it is. And so, um,
Can we break that down really quickly? Because
mhm,
I think you're saying something that brings us back to kind of a central thought that we explore all the time. And it's also really important to say, Oliver, all of these conversations that you and I are having, we have to address them as if we're just doing our best to try to break this down.
mhm.
But we don't know. There's no ownership of these ideas here. But one of the things that we talk about all the time is that if you can use the mental tool of being able to assume that your mind and your body are mirrors of each other,
Mhm.
right? So if you've lived, let's say you've lived in food scarcity, that is a real, I mean, that's a real experience that you're having in your body. Your body is reacting to something. It's causing your mind to be able to have to bring hyper focus to this one thing that you need to do because it understands, your body understands that that's a survival mechanism. So the intensity of that has got to be really high. But, you know, if food equals starvation to your body, it might also be that love equals starvation to your mind.
Right.
So if you grew up in an environment where no one was giving you unconditional love, where you were treated poorly for whatever reason, it might be a starvation of emotional support
Mhm.
in your nervous system that is very difficult to be able to address. But just like anything else, you have to address it. Otherwise, you just end up um, having, at best, you end up being someone who has a subconscious pattern that's playing out in a way that does not benefit everyone else. And at worst, we probably have people out there who just don't have feelings and they don't
Right.
they don't give a shit, and their only goal is to make sure that they get one step ahead of everybody else at any cost. And that's not good for the rest of us. You know what I mean? Like, nobody should be cool with sociopaths. It's not they're not, it's not an acceptable thing to happen. And as far as I can tell, boy, it feels like there must be some in charge out there, because the way that the world is going seems like it's like we've never had more opportunity for prosperity, and yet it feels like, at least in my lifetime, I've never felt um, an appetite for violence at this fever pitch. Like,
Yeah.
there's never been a time in human history where violence was less necessary, and yet it seems like all of the conversation is about getting people to talk about how necessary it is.
Well, one of the things that I've heard mentioned several times from my dad, is this idea of, the world has been living in a pretty unprecedented time of peace with very minimal violent conflict internationally, since the end of World War II. But that we're in a time now where the last people to have actually lived through World War One and World War II are, rapidly leaving us. And that perspective of how desperately we need to avoid this thing uh, is is also leaving us. And we might know from a theoretical standpoint that we don't want to be at war. But I would imagine, I mean, I'm certain that that's quite different than the a level of priority that has with someone who has lived through that experience. And it almost takes us back to another thing that we often tend to talk about, is the idea of how necessary is trauma to growth, right? How necessary is it that you experience something to know that you have to avoid it? Because if it is necessary, which I don't think it is, right? But that would seem to imply that we would always be stuck in a cycle of war, and then we'd realize how we don't want this, and then we would have a certain age of prosperity, and then we would end up eventually with a generation of people who no longer remember, and then they have to make the mistake again for themselves. I truly hope, and I'm optimistic about the fact that that is not true. Um, but it it there is something interesting about those kinds of challenges that come up every few generations that we don't put them into our education, like with something like a tyrannical government or the collapse of an effective government. This is something that typically happens in a country every few generations or something, and so you don't teach courses on it. Like we might teach abstract courses about history and about tyrants, but there's no course out there about how to prevent your country from falling into such a predicament. And it's same thing with war. And I think that especially with AI equalizing the playing field on certain sort of intellectual disciplines, that we might want to really think about the kinds of things that we teach people, right? Like maybe we should be teaching people how to determine what the truth is in a world full of disinformation. Maybe we should be teaching people how to
But that we could even
not be manipulated.
well, I love both of those ideas, but whose truth,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Well,
So
it would be a
it's
skill, I guess, right? Like
right.
of just of
Well, I
doing
mean,
your due
right.
diligence.
And obviously that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure it out, but we don't know for sure that we even have the formula for that. It could take decades for people to be able to figure out how we can make some movement. But like at its core, Oliver, have you ever been in a fight before, a physical fight with someone?
Yes, but not ever one that wasn't sort of like planned, I
Okay,
guess.
so you've decided with consent to fight someone else.
Yeah.
But have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight?
No.
Okay, that's great, right? Lots of people have been in it. I mean, and it looks like once someone fights, then they let go of something.
Hmm.
And there's plenty of studies that show that, that if you want to change the biology of the chemicals that are being released, one of the ways that does do that is physical aggression.
Hmm.
But it doesn't solve anything. In fact, I don't think that we can try, but I don't think that there's a case to be made that physical violence has a single positive attribute to it at all in any direction. It never solves a problem, and it is almost guaranteed to create one uh, every time,
Except maybe
except for with
entertainment.
consent.
Right.
Except
Yeah.
for with consent. But like people look down on the MMA and that kind of stuff, but those are probably people who, if they didn't have MMA, would be extremely violent people for other reasons because that's just, they're warriors. That's who they are. So what an amazing thing that they were able to find this beautiful sport where they're able to learn unbelievable technique and precision to be able to channel that into something positive. Like we should be looking at, MMA and the athletes as shining examples of how you take something that could be turned into something incredibly negative and instead turn it into a competitive way of being able to express yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Because that is something that those people have a natural proclivity for because of I mean, really, I guess because in most of modern history, well, I guess most of all history, and even prehistory, right? Even just the the Earth before humans, um, the need to be violent, aggressive, protective, dominant is a very real thing, and so it makes sense that that exists. But it is a great example of how we can take something and sort of think about it a little bit and say, and turn it into something positive.
I believe every generation should be able to make their own determination as to whether violence is necessary, right? Because I don't know. I didn't live in those other generations. If I go back 100 years, 200 years, 300 years ago, I might be exactly as violent as, if I was born into a Viking culture, do I think that I would be peaceful in that? Probably not, right? Because that would be ridiculous. You'd have to be able to create character in the environment that you're in. And maybe there is opportunity in those generations. There might have been different opportunities for peace that weren't sought out.
Yeah.
But in this generation, I feel like, because I don't consider myself to be the smartest guy in the room, and because I definitely understand that I am not deeply educated. I didn't graduate from college. I don't have a formal education of any kind. One of the things that I feel like I can observe people who have formal educations and are extremely brilliant, what happens to them is they tend to go look in the past to try to figure out the predictor for the future,
Mm.
which I think makes a lot of sense. If you understand human patterns, you can see that humans haven't changed all that much. We follow similar patterns. Whatever we are aware of in that moment is something that we can focus on potentially bringing change to. But if you're not aware of something, it's just going to become a recurring model that happens over and over again. And the more deeply that gets embedded in social structure, the more you can see whole social structures that move at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that everybody's not talking about is that the part of history that doesn't repeat itself is technology. We've never lived with the technology that we have right now,
Mm-hmm.
which means that we have to completely rethink how we want to live based on the technology.
Yeah.
And if we allow even a little bit of violence into this technology, we are so screwed.
There is one important pattern with technology that I think emerges, and sort of like a classic example of this is with the cars, right? So cars came out, and it took, I think, something like 60 years for lobbyists to be able to make seatbelts necessary. And it was clear. It was very clear that car crashes were killing people, and that adding a seatbelt would save those people, right, from not only putting themselves at harm, but putting other people at harm. Um, but it took, I believe, and I wouldn't be certain about this, but something like 60 years for those safety guards to be put in place. And I think that that's the recurring pattern is oftentimes with technology, we wait until the consequences have struck before we're able to actually regulate something.
Yeah.
And that's one of the areas that we really, really need to start improving that cycle time on. It'd be really great, for example, with AI, if we could try and foresee those consequences and put some regulations in place, which is obviously a very complicated thing because the AI, it's also kind of like an arms race, right? But yeah, that's something that we definitely
Well, we've
need
got
to
to
be
be
careful about.
proactive, not reactive.
Right.
If
Exactly.
we're reactive, we've already created something that is smarter than us. So being reactive to something that's getting smarter every day that has exceeded our
Mhm.
capacity for intelligence, would be a massive mistake, right?
Right.
Like that's not even that. You don't have to be smart to know that that's true.
And to go off into a slightly different direction here, a little dystopian thoughts, but AI. I mean, imagine what it takes for one person to manipulate another person, right? Like if you know someone who is very highly manipulative and good at manipulating other people, they're doing that based on the information that they're able to collect, usually just from interacting with them, right? Like,
I
or maybe they do their research, right? Like if they're like a super spy, maybe they go and dig up your past and find, do some Freudian psychoanalysis on you to try and determine what's going to work. But an AI trying to manipulate someone has access to every, potentially, right? And probably every text you've ever sent, every Google search you've ever searched, everything you've ever watched, every comment you've ever, every reaction. It potentially even has your biometrics as you're perceiving these things, right? If you have an Apple Watch or your phone camera, right, it might have listened to every conversation. If all these things about the Snowden, revelations are true about all of this data being constantly recorded and analyzed. The ability that an artificial intelligence would have to manipulate someone would be uh, astronomically higher than any manipulation on a human to human basis. And that would be even before you consider how much more intelligent it is than us.
Yeah, I mean, I use AI every single day a lot, and there's no doubt that it's designed to be a sycophant.
Right.
And that is probably the most subtle and sophisticated version of manipulation that happens socially.
And just a, funny thing, I, just a this is a not really something that I think is really true, but you know, if you ask AI right now, where should I invest my money? What are the expanding markets? What's a good place for me to place my resources? It will tell you to invest in AI infrastructure, which is just the sort of the general consensus, right? People are investing in robotics, and I
Right.
know that some of the stuff that I had, like I had some money in like the semiconductors, and that's gone crazy. But it is also kind of funny to think like, oh yeah, you ask the AI what to invest in, what to put your money to, and they tell you to put it into the AI infrastructure.
Yeah, except for it's telling the truth.
No, it is.
So and that's the other thing that we shouldn't forget about AI is that it is also simultaneously, although there are parts of this conversation that can feel a little doom and gloom, the other side that we need to pay attention to is that this thing is telling the truth. This thing is looking at all the world's information and it's trying to discern, you know, what is the most accurate out of all of this information and then providing that to you.
Well,
That
you used the word consensus a few days ago, and I think that's maybe more accurate. But
yeah,
more so than the truth, it gives you the consensus.
right, which at any given time has to be the closest to the
Yeah,
truth,
right.
right? Because otherwise you could never stop manipulation because you'd have to say that one person has ownership over the truth over someone else.
Hmm.
And then by the very nature of that, you're saying that people aren't equal.
Right.
But
I thought
but
one of the really interesting things that came out of the language and thinking episode as well was the idea of approaching truth, um, which is like comes from the mathematical concept is like in calculus you often have an equation like with an it's basically it's approaching a value but it doesn't ever quite reach somewhere, which I think is a very interesting idea to apply to truth.
truth is extremely elusive. I mean, we could talk about how many things we actually think are true. I think this came up in an episode not too long ago where we tried to, even in the last episode, I
I
think, where
think,
we
yeah.
we tried to just say, but like for you, how many things do you're in your early 20s, how many things do you think are true?
Well, it's interesting because there's a few things like there's the sort of I honestly think that there's if we're talking about things that you can be absolutely certain about beyond any shadow of a doubt,
Yeah.
that most of the things that you can say are true are kind of useless. Like there's a very classic example, and this is you've called this mental masturbation before, and I think that that's kind of an accurate thing. It's like there's this classic Descartes saying, "I think, therefore I am," and that this is the only true statement, or like what it's an absolutely true statement, and so it's the kind of like a starting point for trying to establish more things that are true.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, okay, yeah, I mean that's true without a doubt from whatever perspective you're in your own consciousness, right? Like I can't even say for certain that other people are conscious, right? Because I can't measure that, which is another interesting thing about AI, right? Is that you can't. Consciousness exists in a sort of physically intangible place, and so you can't confirm other people's consciousness. I assume everyone else is conscious because they're a whole lot like me, it seems like. But the fact that you are conscious and that you are having an experience is sort of like the fundamentally most true thing at any second. If you are thinking, then you exist, and it's like, okay, well, this is actually useful information, and I think maybe helped further philosophy in some way, but at the same time, it's like, okay, like that doesn't actually provide me with anything that I didn't already know. And that's the interesting thing. Like, there's these other true statements, right? Like a circle is round. Uh, It's like, well, that's just the definition of a circle. So like, is
Right.
that true? Is that always true? Yes. But it's because it's like just a self-referring loop. I think that I think that in terms of talking about truth, it's really interesting to distinguish things like absolute truth, which sometimes gets called like an a priori truth, something that's self-evident like that, that's certain. But then there's also functional truth, which I think is the thing that's more elusive, but more useful, of course. And so I think, um, you know, those ones are more sort of like generally true things. That are in this sort of like approaching truth, right? Where you might have something that's true most of the time, but even with gravity, which I know came up on our last one, it's like
Mm-hmm.
I assume we have a law of gravity, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it's still an assumption at the end of the day that when I wake up tomorrow, I'm going to fall onto the floor, not the ceiling. Like you can't test things that are happening in the future, so the future is kind of like devoid of truth. The future doesn't quite have any truth yet, in a way.
I think honestly, we might have at some point gotten it a little bit backwards where the truth really exists in spiritual conversations,
hmm
but probably does not exist in scientific conversations because we're always trying to discover the next piece of truth when it comes to exploration and science and space and like there is nothing that is done. It's you've got to stay infinitely curious about everything to be able to know what's next. But where I started to personally, I'm not saying that this is true for everybody else. This might just be my truth. But when I in my second marriage, I had a stepson who I came to love and thought, still think is an exceptional human being, one of the smartest people I've ever known. But as I was trying to figure out how to be a father and be a stepfather, I had to be really honest with myself that those weren't the same things. You know what I mean? The feelings that I had for my kids and the feelings that I had for my stepson were not the same. And so I had to figure out how to become extremely honest but with both my kids and my stepson about what that is and how I could provide the most I can in either direction without trying to pretend like they're the same thing.
hmm
That kind of truth gets almost spiritual.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because the only thing that I can say for sure that I know is the truth, Oliver, is that like, and I think we've even had this conversation before, but I am sure that if somebody gave me the choice between giving my life to keep, to make sure that my kids kept theirs,
hmm
I am 100% confident that that would be an unequivocal yes without a hesitation.
Right.
Anybody other than them, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because it touches on something else I think that's come up with us is the difference between sort of the extrinsic and intrinsic motivations and the idea that you might do something for someone else ultimately because it makes you feel a certain way, but that when it comes to your kids, there's an evolutionary like incentive that's like, no, it's like it's literally about them. It's not about you.
Yeah, right. Which I think is also necessary because I'm not saying that you have to have kids to be able to do this. I'm just saying kids do this,
hmm
which is that they become an almost instantaneous opportunity to break your narcissism.
Yeah.
So if you have any interest in being good at being a parent, you realize very quickly that you cannot focus on yourself anymore. That you have to wake up every day and you've got to give your focus to to making sure that doesn't mean that you should ignore yourself, but you have to make sure that you are putting your time and energy and your actions towards making sure that you're promoting their best interest at all times. And doing that is a great way to be able to bump into a lot of times where you feel uncomfortable, like, oh, I'd rather be doing this. I'd rather be being lazy sitting on the couch. I'd rather do this or that. And then when you actually put that time and invest it in something where you can see some level of progress, prosperity come out of it, nobody ever looks back and like, oh man, I wish I stayed on the couch.
Right.
Everybody always feels like, I'm glad that I did. I'm
Right.
glad that
Well,
I'm glad that I took that step forward. I'm glad that, and I think that that's all it is just every day trying to gradually get a little bit better than you were yesterday.
that brings me to something that is sort of one of my spiritual truths, and I think it's interesting the idea you put forward about physical truth not being real, but spiritual truth being real, and I think that's interesting because I think a lot of people would say the exact opposite of that. I'm not
Right. I
sure.
actually think we're living in a world that believes the exact opposite. And I'm not saying that
Yeah.
anybody's wrong,
Mhm.
Oliver. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, as I look at things as objectively as I'm capable of doing,
Yeah.
it strikes me that the people who are having spiritual conversations are tapping into something that feels much more human.
Yeah.
And the people who are having scientific conversations as if they know something all look like they are desperate to try to be right. And I don't think that science is about being right. I think science is about wonder and exploration and
Well,
curiosity.
it is interesting because there is and this is I want to go back to the other thing I was about to say, but this little tangent is this is a quote a quote that I've heard is which is something along the lines of like scientists don't change their minds, they just die and get replaced. So it's really interesting. Science does, I think, scientists tend to have a pet hypothesis. The best ones don't, right? The best ones are just interested in the truth. But it is a driver of human progress, the intellectual desire to be correct and to discover something, to be a pioneer. But that ultimately that's not the most efficient way to do that. And it's one of these tools that's like it was good enough to get into the toolbox, but it's not the best tool. The best tool for science is curiosity, not ego. And yet, ego has probably been responsible for so much of the progress that we've made.
Well, we should also consider the fact that, we have an ego for a reason.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
yeah.
important, you know what I mean? So I don't think I don't know I don't know how far back this goes. I'm sure it goes way, way back, but this idea of like a good voice on one shoulder and a bad voice on another shoulder.
Yeah.
I think that we misinterpret that as being good and bad. And really what it's doing is like balance, find balance,
Hmm.
find out how you can not be naive by assuming that everything is, gonna turn out exactly the way you want it to, but also don't be the aggressor in making sure that you create a bad situation and finding that balance in between those two places.
Hmm.
If you're, I would consider what we're doing social science.
Yeah.
And at best, no matter how hard we work for the rest of our lives, Oliver, at best, we might be able to accomplish creating a layer of truth.
Right.
But we're not creating something that is the truth. It just hopefully is a layer that someone else can build upon to be
Yeah.
able to build something that's even better, even closer. And I think we might need curiosity and conversation to be able to start to remember that spiritual part of ourselves needs the same amount of attention that the scientific part of our world has been getting, and
Absolutely.
that both of those, I don't want to give up at all on the scientific part either, right? So it's not about taking from one to give to the other. It's about trying to figure out how we find equal importance and balance between the two.
Well, one of the things that I think was coming up for me as a sort of like a spiritual truth, because I guess you asked me this a little while ago, and there's a couple things that are coming to mind now, which is first of all is I found it to be very true that very often do I regret not doing something.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just interesting, comparing that to something like I think therefore I am. Like that's far more useful in your actual life. To say I'm acknowledging the fact that even on the days where I feel like I don't have the energy to go and do this thing and go to this event and socialize with these people and put this work in or whatever it might be, whatever reason that it is that you're feeling like you don't want to do something, that you're never, unless you're about to do something that you really that you wouldn't want to do anyways, um, that you are never going to regret, going out and meeting those people or whatever it is. Like, and it, of course, it's not absolutely true. Like maybe you go out and there's a, a horrible, violent event that happens or whatever. But generally, I've had so many times in my life where I've almost not done the thing, and I just think, wow, if I had not done that after doing it, that I'm like, wow, I'm so glad that I made the decision to go out there and do it. And it comes down, it even applies to coming here. I found that letter, and then I rescheduled my meeting to come here the next day. And I sort of like was I think it was a Saturday, and I was kind of up late, and I was realizing, oh, I'm going to be a little bit late. And then I was like, oh man, do I even really want to go if I'm going to be late? Because I don't like to be late, and I want to show up to whatever this strange event is, at my best. But of course I went anyways, and here we are now, several months later. And if I had decided that day that I wasn't feeling up for it for that reason, right, that I didn't want to be late, or that I was feeling tired or groggy or whatever it was, um, that would have been a tremendous mistake. And so that's a kind of a truth that I always find is like, whenever you're feeling like you don't have the energy to go and do something, usually when you do it, almost immediately you find that you actually do have the energy, and that you wouldn't have wanted it to be any other way.
So
Those are the kind of truths I think that we'll be able to distribute. You know what I mean?
yeah, and I think that the truth in what you're saying, it might even be a layer deeper than that, Oliver, because in my life, I don't disagree with the idea that when my intuition has told me to do something and I do it, that's has yielded excellent results. But there's also been times where I've learned over a long period of time that just because the phone is ringing doesn't mean that I should answer it all the time.
Right.
So it's like the maturity to understand what are the times that that you go and have the experience, and what are the times that you stay quiet and that you figure out how to stay focused and organized for what it is that you are really trying to achieve. Because in the end, I think what's at the very base of all that truth is time.
Mm.
You have a limited amount of it. So wasting it by doing nothing is a tragedy.
Yeah.
But spending it doing something that's going to cause you future drama is an equal tragedy. If you're continuing to perpetuate patterns that are not promoting the best interest of your existence, that's not, you didn't win just because you went out for that night.
Right.
But if you went out and you had something that enriched your life because you were there,
Hmm.
then you got to do it. And I think it's a completely different game depending on your age, right? So if you're in your 20s, what it means to go out and take risks and do fun things and have amazing experiences is completely different than when you're later on in your life and you have kids and you have responsibilities and you have things that you need to do.
True.
So it to me, the baseline truth is about making sure that you are always examining the value of your time, and that you're never spending your time on something that your intuition is telling you not to,
Hmm.
which is so hard. I'm 44 years old and I think about this all the time. I mean, I think about my time constantly, and I still am struggling on a day-to-day basis to figure out exactly how to get a 100% read on my intuition. I think I'm getting much, much better at it. I think I'm better at it now than I have ever been at any other point in my life. But I still run into things where I'm feeling insecure, and I've got to sit with that for a second and evaluate it and start to look at, like, okay, are the feelings that I'm getting of defensiveness or of whatever it is, whatever that negative feeling is, can I observe it for a second and figure out what about that is leaning me towards being able to make a decision from my intuition, not from a place of fear or a negative emotion, which, you know, drives so much of our lives is, trying to avoid something instead of trying to steer ourselves towards something.
making a decision out of fear, I think often ends up perpetuating the thing that you're afraid of, and even creating something that you're afraid of that wasn't actually there. Maybe, you know what I mean. Whereas if you can make decisions, hopefully out of love, then I think you're much more likely to create the things that you can or will love.
I watched a documentary a couple weeks ago. While I was making dinner, I would just turn it on every night. And the documentary was called Dark Wizard, I think.
Sounds fucking sick.
It was sick. And the whole documentary is about this free solo climber that came
I think I know that guy. That guy's off his rocker.
off his rocker, right? So he was he was the first person to start free soloing really difficult things. And then I'm forgetting his name right now, but you can look him up. The guy that's come along now, who's just the greatest of all time, undeniably. Hamill or,
I'm looking.
anyways, this documentary, it had this really compelling start to it, where basically the documentary is about a guy who takes extraordinary risks, and it shows him in the younger parts of his years as being a very wild young man, using a ton of drugs, having all of these crazy experiences. Him and his friends were,
Alex Honnold.
yeah, that's the guy who is extremely well organized and is probably a shining example of what it can look like to do amazing things with intention.
Mm-hmm.
And then this other guy, and you can look up his name too, just so we get it right. That's who the documentary was about. And he did it the opposite side of it, where he described when he was a kid, he kept having this recurring dream over and over again where he was falling. And he felt like while he was falling to his death. And right before he hits the ground, in his dream, there were these ravens that come in
Mm-hmm.
and then put themselves underneath him somehow and protect him from the impact that he has when he hits the ground.
Is it Adam Ondra or
That doesn't sound familiar, but I don't have the strong enough memory to.
Janja Garnbrett?
No, that's not it.
Okay.
Yeah, you could put in HBO Dark Wizard, and that would probably.
Oh yeah. Okay. Cool.
But the point of saying all of this is that he made it very clear in this documentary that dream became his primary fear. He had this intense fear of.
Dean Potter.
Yes, that's it. And he had this intense fear of falling to his death. And so to fight against that, he would push himself to do these extreme rock climbing things where, the obvious result of making a mistake is that he falls to his death. But he kept pushing the boundaries of that over and over again. And he, to push the boundaries, he kept getting further and further away from his intuition and more into, trying to satisfy some egoic desire to be able to beat this thing.
Right.
And that competitive nature kind of took over. And then Alex Honnold, is that his name?
Yeah.
Came along, and he had a completely different approach to it. He had this very analytical and honest approach to hey, listen, if I just practice hard enough and I figure out how to do this the right way, and I have amazing technique, and I have, I have a relentless work ethic to make sure that I can climb things that nobody's ever climbed before. I don't need to be a wild man. I just need to make sure that I'm prepared and that I know that I can do this. And then he went and did things that had never been done and maybe will never be done again, because he's a complete anomaly.
It's really interesting, the thing with Dean Potter, because it almost sounds like it's, I don't know if I would say that he's making those decisions out of fear, but
for sure.
It is an interesting contrast, and it takes me back to another thing where I think that often when we've identified something that feels profoundly true, that often the exact opposite of that can also be true. Which, I wouldn't swear that that's true, but it's just something I've observed. And in some writing, they often do something called a reversal, where they go and they give you the context of which makes the thing that they just said not true anymore. But what this is making me think of is actually Batman, which I told you that I recently watched. I think I watched the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy when I was a child, but I didn't really remember it.
Hmm.
And I just recently rewatched all of them.
Very
And
good.
Batman is the fear is the primary theme of the first Batman.
Hmm.
That he falls into the well and the bats scare the shit out of him, and he has to overcome that fear, and that there's this drug that induces extreme fear and hallucinations, and that it's he goes to the temple with Ra's al Ghul, and they are trying to indoctrinate him into the League of Shadows, and the thing he has to do constantly is fight his fear and fight his fear. And then in the last Batman movie, uh, with
Bane.
Bane, yeah. He gets sent to that prison, right, where they all have to climb out,
Hmm.
and he tries a couple times to climb out, and there's this one leap that he has to make with this rope tied around him,
Hmm.
and the one of the sort of like these sort of like archetypal wise characters at the bottom tells him at one point after he's failed several times that in order to make it out, he's going to have to do what the only other person to ever make it out was, which was this kid who got out was try the jump without the rope, and that fear for his life will return to him, and that will ultimately be the thing that gets him there.
Hmm.
And and it and it does. And I think something that's coming to mind for me is it's similar to the insecurity thing. It's like fear is a tool, right? Fear is obviously built into us for a very good reason. But I think maybe that what it comes down to is that if you're making a fear about something that's real, then that's a very good decision. Um, you should obviously be afraid of falling to your death, uh, but that if you're making a decision based on fear about something that's not real, that's when you're more likely to create a problem than solve one.
So, what I would be really interested in exploring in all this, Oliver, is the idea that it would appear to me that your brain, your mind, creates the reality of anything you believe.
Hmm.
So, if you hold on to a fear for too long, you are also going to manifest a reality that brings you towards that fear.
Right.
Like if you took the fear of falling to your death, the most logical way to be able to make sure that you don't fall to your death is to learn how to climb really well.
Right.
Because if you put me on the side of a mountain and you put Alex Hommel on the side of a mountain, the chances that I fall to my death are significantly higher than him.
Hmm.
So I think that it there might be an even deeper conversation in all of this to really say like, well, how much value is there in believing? Like what's the value of building a belief system about things that you could end up manifesting, negative things as easily as you could manifest positive things? Or how do you focus on positive thinking to make sure that you are, you're bringing that energy towards you?
Right.
And I don't even like saying words like manifest and energy towards you and all that shit because, to be honest,
I like manifest, but I
it,
agree with. I know what you're saying.
I want it to be I want it to become scientific that we
Right.
start to figure this out. And I think it's really annoying that the spiritual side of the way that we start looking at our mind, which I think feels spiritual because it's invisible,
Hmm.
but I think that there are laws to it in the same way that there are laws to nature, and that there are laws,
Yeah.
and those laws of nature have taught us so much about the physical world and science and the way that we've been able to expand technology.
Yeah.
And I think we need to look at our minds in the exact same way. We have to be committed to being able to dissect ourselves all the way down to what belief is worth having. And I feel like we're at a crossroads right now because the world has just pushed us all a little bit too far.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? It's a little bit too much when we're supposed to take a side on any given issue when we have people who are murdering kids. You know what I mean? Like that's like there should be some basic laws to the way that people believe that humanity needs to support each other.
Hmm.
And that to me seems like the most primary one, is that you protect your innocent.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm very, very hopeful that the world is heading in the right direction, but I think we should not be ignorant to the idea that we might have a real struggle in front of us to make sure that we all start to come together around this idea that violence isn't helping us in any form. And we should continue to have the most sophisticated conversations we can to uncover the logic as to why it has never helped and it will never help, and that we should anybody who wants to make a logical argument for violence, other than from the perspective of saying, if you are the aggressor, I have the permission to be able to protect myself.
One of the most interesting human agreements that I think exists, and I think I use the word interesting because I'm just not sure what to make of it, is the Geneva Convention, right? It comes out of a very war-torn Europe. I think after World War I, where there were some pretty horrendous weapons that were used in these conflicts, and a bunch of people sat down, I guess in Geneva, and decided, of all of the ways that we are saying are okay to tear each other apart and blow each other to smithereens, there's a few that we just will not tolerate. And if you use these, the entire world order, United Nations as we currently stand, or whatever organization there was, is going to defend the people that you are using these weapons against. And they include things like poisoned bullets and three-sided swords, and all sorts of things. I mean, it's like it's just so interesting because on the one hand, it's like, okay, I mean, it's hard to argue against banning these technologies and weapons, right? But on the other hand, it just seems so ridiculous that what's built into that is that we're saying all the other ones are okay.
Right. As far as I'm concerned, it is absolute mental masturbation.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just people who think that they're intellectuals arguing over, the appropriate way to do something that is going to create a ripple effect that will never end.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's complicated. You just have to follow who benefits. And I heard this morning, I can't verify this is true. You can look it up to make sure that we're not being inaccurate, although, I don't know, who cares? But but that 80% of the tax revenue in the United States is now going to defense. 80% of all of the money that comes in from taxes is redirected towards defense.
Let's see. I'm going to check that.
If that's true, whoa. You know what I mean? If that's our 80-20 rule, 80% of all of our money is going towards perpetuating violence, and only 20% is left to be able to make sure that we fix our roads, we take care of building, new schools, that we're doing all of the things that would actually help us build stronger, more connected communities. And yet we're spending 80% on it going elsewhere in the world and creating a level of chaos that does not look like it's going to be able to end.
The number that I'm seeing is 13%. It's possible that this is not up to date. I think 80% would be. That doesn't sound right to me. I think that this is probably correct.
I heard it from the person who I heard it from was Dennis Kucinich, who is I think that's what his name is. He's a congressman from Ohio.
Interesting.
And he ran for president twice, in 2004 and 2008, something like that.
Let me see.
So I'm not 13% is too much for me. So
right. I mean,
but I do.
Perhaps a different way to look at it is, it's over $1 trillion.
And it made a massive jump in 2026 was the other part of what he was saying, that, we could check for accuracy. But I don't want to get stuck in the numbers,
Yeah.
not because I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
think that the numbers matter. They do matter, and I think we should make every effort to be accurate. But the reality is that we all know that we're spending more money on perpetuating violence than we are on perpetuating peace. And I think if you want to break any addiction, the first thing you have to do is decide that you don't want to be addicted to it anymore.
Right.
And I don't think that everybody has gotten to that point. I think everybody still feels like they're getting a little bit of like anger and oomph every morning that they wake up so that they can be fucking pissed about something. You know what I mean? That like somebody's fucking pissing them off, and that is allowing them to be able to feel alive and have energy. And if things started to get better, then would they be able to still have that same sort of like,
Right.
you
Desire
know,
to feel powerful. Yeah.
I don't know, it's even a desire to feel powerful. It's like a
Or empowered, maybe is a better word.
alive,
Right.
you know, because sometimes negative feelings make you feel very alive, very present, very in that moment. You feel a level of intensity that is addicting, because it's got to be it's got to be some sort of dopamine hit, some sort of chemical release in your body when you get to those points, which from we've talked about this so many times. I don't have social media. I very clearly remember when Facebook came out, which was probably when my oldest son, who's now 19, was a baby. And it probably had been around for longer than that, but I had been avoiding it. And I remember avoiding Facebook back then, even to jump onto Facebook, because I remember thinking like, man, this is going to be very hard to not feel tempted to go try to talk to people from high school, or, I was married at the time. I had kids. Like, it just seemed like this wild world of temptation
Mm-hmm.
to be able to be distracted from what it was that you were actually, trying to focus on in that given time. And so I avoided it for a while, and then eventually got onto it, and it was an amazing. There are amazing opportunities to be able to see what people are doing that you haven't connected with in a long time. And it was also exactly what I thought it was, which is that it was a very difficult temptation every day to avoid feeling like if everything isn't going exactly the way that you want it, that you get this escape of being able to, be in this other world. And I didn't stick with it for very long because to be honest, I didn't really trust myself. I didn't feel like that pull to be able to be a part of it was tough.
I've got something that almost is an interesting sort of full circle moment to this idea that the technologies that we create are a reflection of ourself, and it also ties into our conversation about belief. And I think the interesting thing about the power of belief is that it's a conversation that can't help but trying to unify the sort of the duality between physical truth and spiritual truth. It's kind of like sits right there. And I think that one of the really interesting scientific sides of the conversation that I've seen about belief is that there's a part of your brain called your reticular activation system, which is essentially responsible for, there's a massive amount of information that your brain receives through sensory input all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the amount of it is astronomically larger than the amount of it that you're able to attend to and what they would call perceive, right? Like right now, you're perceiving my voice, but you're probably not, until I mention it, perceiving the sensation of your feet on the ground, right? And the slight pressure on the balls of your feet or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that information is getting tuned out, whereas the information that you believe is relevant is the information that you are perceiving. You're not perceiving the temperature of the air unless it's too hot or too cold. And one of the really interesting things about this is that one of the determining factors for the things that you perceive versus don't perceive is whether they conform with your model of the world. So you're far more likely to perceive all of the little details that support your worldview than the ones that don't. for example, if you're in a coffee shop and you're a musician or something, you're much likely to, of all the random conversations and chatter in the room, you're much more likely to pick up on the ones about music. But the more insidious thing about this is that if you are the kind of person that, is very insecure and hates yourself or whatever it is, you might also then perceive all of the conversations in the room that are related to that. Or you might hear someone say something like I don't like this drink or something, and you might accidentally perceive that someone's talking about you that way. And with social media and with the internet, we've built a larger version of this same confirmation bias where people get drawn into communities and forums and places where they never have to have their beliefs challenged.
So I'm just speaking for myself. I don't want to challenge people's beliefs. Like whatever your thoughts are, whatever your feelings are, Oliver, like I want you to be able to have those. I want those to be sacred to you, and they are who you are. They're really special.
But what if those are like, I don't think that all people are equal?
You got to work that out on your own. I
Right.
can't control that anyways, right? So if that's the thought you have, then I would love to have a conversation with you to be able to kind of understand how you came to that conclusion and see if there's why our perspectives don't align on that one.
This is going to get clipped. I'm going to look real bad.
But yeah. But in the end, what I would say is that I do want to judge you on your actions.
Yeah.
Because I think that everybody deserves to be able to have their thoughts. There are all kinds of thoughts that come through your head in a given day. And I have found that for me personally, I have felt a lot more personal peace when I try to control my environment so that I'm controlling my thoughts. Because if I walk into an environment if I walk into a coffee shop and that coffee shop is consistently filled with people who have just a negative vibe to it, I'm going to feel negative when I walk into that room.
Mm-hmm.
If I walk into a space that has a tremendous positive vibe to it, that's a room that I would gravitate towards more because those are the feelings that I want to be able to have on a consistent basis. But the most reliable way to be able to have peaceful feelings is to be alone. And I don't think that that's necessarily the most exciting thing to do, but it is reliably an opportunity that if you can find peace by yourself, then you know that you can always come back to that anytime you need it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and that's absolutely true. And it's unfortunate that I feel like a lot of people don't know how to build peace in their alone time. I feel like there's many people who are afraid to be alone.
Well, sure, they should be. It's terrible sometimes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I've shared this with you many times, but I've spent the last essentially a year and a half now spending a lot of time alone, a lot. And sometimes I feel great about it. Sometimes I find my own little patterns and I've discovered so many things that I love to do. And I don't care if anybody else likes it. You know what I mean? I don't have to ask anybody else. I don't have to figure out whether, I don't have to get anybody's approval. I just do exactly what I like to do. And the basic rule that I try to follow is that it can't distract me from, being completely present for my kids. It can't distract me from being completely focused and present in my work. And that I, every day I want to try to be a little bit better than I was yesterday. So that has given me a decent framework to try to make sure that my patterns are relatively healthy. But I was terrified of being alone. It was the number one thing that I was afraid of. And in the same way that we talked about the dark magic or whatever that documentary was, where the guy had a dream about being terrified of falling to his death and then spent the rest of his life trying to make, these series of crazy decisions to do things to be able to kind of avoid that or fight that. I feel like I could tell a very similar story in my 20s and 30s, how I was so afraid to be alone that I ended up subconsciously allowing myself to make decisions that didn't put me in a position to be able to not be alone.
Mm-hmm.
and then you've got to face those consequences and figure that out. But um, nothing gets better unless you figure it out. Like if you leave something where you've got, you're holding on to just a little bit more fear, you're holding on to a belief that's not in your best interest, it eventually catches up to you. It's just when, and another thing that we talked about on a podcast the other day is just this examination of how much short-term loss is worth long-term gain.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, as a young man, what do you think? Like what level of daily delayed gratification are you willing to deal with to be able to make sure that the future version of Oliver is set up extremely well?
So this is something I think about a lot, because I think that finding that balance is really hard. Deciding what you want to have for yourself today. It's like if I spend my whole I'm 22 right now. If I spend the next 8 years until I'm 30, just with my head down, grinding, trying to set myself up for a better future, then I'm gonna miss potentially some of the best, l- remaining, years of my life where I feel truly youthful. Um, and truthfully, I think that I have done well so far to try and find that balance, because I think really there's a couple of sort of indicators that can tell you, right? Because I don't think anyone can ever find um, I don't think that there's any universal truth about how much you should sacrifice your time now for the present. But I think that if you don't feel good about what your future looks like based on your current situation, right? Like if you're thinking about, oh, well, based on what I have now, whether that be savings or your job or your relationships or whatever, and you think about those things and then you think about the future and you feel like that makes you uncomfortable, then that's probably an indication that you need to spend a little bit more time putting some work in, to get yourself, to lay down some investment for your future. Um, but that at the same time, if you're in your present moment and you're thinking about your day to day life and you're like, wow, this is miserable, maybe that's an indication that you need to spend a little bit more time, working on the present moment, because your life doesn't just exist in the future. In fact, I would argue, it, it does exist in the future, but most importantly, it exists, right now. And I feel tremendously grateful for the fact that I have, I have many shortcomings, but I think one of the things that I've had as a positive attribute that I've just always had is the feeling, really more than anything, that I needed to get the most out of my one ticket on this, life, right? And that I feel like I needed to get right to doing, the things that I really wanted to do, and that I didn't have any interest really in doing the things that everyone else was telling me that I should do, if I didn't see the value in those things. And oftentimes, I've done a lot of traveling, and I think I was lucky to have a family that appreciates that. But I know a lot of people who are incredibly, smart people who don't, who make a lot of money but don't think about how to use that money for anything other than making more money. Um, and I think that maybe one of the number one indicators of the amount that you're going to enjoy this one life that we know about, is your ability to determine for yourself what you want. And I think that maybe that's one of the first things you have to consider when you're having that conversation with yourself about what decisions you want to make for yourself in the present and what decisions you want to make to sacrifice your present self for your future self. Um, it's like you can't even really make that decision unless you know what you want, and you're sure that that's what you want and not what somebody else told you that you should want. Because you might, if you're making sacrifices in the present to try and get something in the future that someone else told you that you should want this, then you've sacrificed both things. Which is just a a, a lose-lose situation.
Yeah, it's also one of those things that is easier said than done. To know what you want is not an easy thing to do. I have found personally that defining what I want has a lot to do with me getting in closer touch with what I believe my potential is.
Mhm.
And then when you kind of are more aligned with who you feel like you are and what you have to contribute, then it makes it a little bit easier to figure out what it is that you want.
Yeah.
But I'm curious for you, Oliver, like how do you examine, so you're somebody who I think has a tremendous tool set, right? You're extremely intelligent, you're kind, you are compassionate. You may do this outside of our relationship, but I've never experienced you being dishonest to yourself, to me, to anybody else. I have always felt like you say it how it is from your perspective, which I've come to admire, and I appreciate that about you. But how do you examine, with all of those great things that you've got going on, how do you look at your potential? How do you examine that to figure out, what you want? How can you be kind to the future version of yourself?
I think that, I mean, it's a tough question. I think
What do you think your potential is? Like when you dream big about where you can go and what you can do, if we just let go of this idea that like someone's going to judge us for this, what's like what's the peak of where you feel like you could reach your potential?
I would like to be in a place in my life where I have the financial and creative freedom to spend my time working on the things that I'm passionate about. And I found that I have a very strong artistic sense. Uh, and that I think that if I could live in a world where I get to wake up every day and create things that I think are beautiful and that would have an effect on the world, I think that's one of the interesting things about art, um, is that it is a human tool for contribution, and whether that's something that's egoic or not is a very interesting conversation. But I think that I believe that I have a perspective that could benefit the world, and that I think, you know, I'm a musician. I would really like to be able to share things that I've put a tremendous amount of myself into with as many people as I can. You know, my ultimate dream as a musician would be to be able to go on tour and to be able to collaborate with other artists, to be able to play, large shows and try and extend the boundaries of what music is. I also think that there's a tremendous amount of potential in me to look at creating new music technologies, which I've done some work with in the past, and I'm always finding new ways to use my musical um, passion. Like, um, it's been a very interesting experiment for me making music that matched to the intro for our unscripted room and the outro, and for the unscripted room game, or whatever game. I don't know what exactly that will be called, but
Curiosity mindset.
curiosity mindset. I think that I do believe that I have the potential to be extremely successful in creative endeavors, and I do think that the way towards that is something that is really difficult. It's a difficult balance to find, specifically in the creative world, because so much of creativity depends on really being patient, and saying, well, how do I keep showing up so that when the inspiration is there, I can capture that. And a lot of that, oftentimes, what that means is that you're not trying to cram your schedule full of a million things, which feels a lot of the time like what you have to do if you want to make any actual success, because you can create something that you believe to be something worthwhile. But if you don't spend any time on the other side of things doing promotion and whatever else it might take to get it out into the world, then it's not going to be discovered. So I think part of my life's task has always been to figure out what that ratio is between allowing myself to be swept up in the things that I'm passionate about versus knowing when and how to really drill down and lock in a disciplined way about the things that don't necessarily interest me as much. Um, but to answer the sort of original question, I would like to be. I mean, I think another interesting way to answer that question is to point to some people that I find to be really inspirational. Right? Take like Tyler the Creator, for example. He is just one of the coolest human beings ever. I would love to live a life the way that he lives his life. He does comedy, he does acting, he does music, he makes every form of art that you could probably make. He makes his album covers. It's just he seems to be an incredibly capable and creative person, and he's found himself or put himself in a position where whatever way that he finds that he wakes up today and he wants to express that he can, and that everything that he touches is gold. And I think that that is an example of someone that I think is a tremendous example, and someone that inspires me heavily. I'm also tremendously inspired by scientific pioneers, people who do something that really changes the world. Um,
So when you imagine, yourself in a position where you've been able to accomplish those things, what's the difference between how you feel about yourself now and the confidence you'd have then?
ooh,
Like, what are the
can you
things?
rephrase that?
Yeah. So, like, if you imagine, like, you know what it is to be you today.
Yeah,
You know where you feel secure. You know where you're still dealing with insecurities. You know where the pluses and minuses are.
hmm
But when you imagine yourself as that future version of yourself that is reaching your potential, what has to change for that to?
I think there's a couple things, which is there's some like specific skill based things, like that I like to perform, um, and I usually when I'm performing I play piano and I'm singing, and I do enjoy singing, and I have a uh other people like to see me play, but there is a difference between what I'm doing currently and you know professional level vocalists. At least in my live performance, I'm able to record things that I wouldn't change anything about. That's probably the least interesting thing, but it's also something that's very tangible, right? And it requires that this other thing, which I think is the more important thing, which is having the ability to be disciplined about building the foundational things that allow you to be ultimately more creative in the end. It's a big thing that comes up in music, right? Which is that you would think maybe it would be easy to think from an outside perspective about music that it's all about being creative and following your bliss and your passion, but a lot of it is sitting down for hours at a time and doing incredibly boring things until you can do those incredibly boring things to a higher degree. That's very much true for singing. You know, you do all sorts of different exercises. It's very much true for piano, mastering your technique and all of these things. And so I think that um, I don't. I think that everything that I see there as being two components to really truly reaching my potential, which is having the inspiration, which I don't find myself to have a deficit of. And I think if I did, the way that I were to improve that is to go out and experience the world, right? Which is something I do all the time, which is why I think I don't experience that deficit, is that I don't have any uh, lack of motivation to go out and find things that make me inspired. Um, but that in order to reach the maximum potential, I've got to I've got to find the balance between the amount of time that goes into that and the amount of time that goes into the more boring things that truly allow you to step up to the next level.
The one thing that I wish maybe I don't remember anybody giving me any real guidance on this when I was younger, but um, remember, I've been essentially since I dropped out of school, which I dropped out after 3 semesters of college.
Mhm.
Since then, I have been trying to be an entrepreneur in a number of different ways, right? So I've had different businesses at different times, and each one of them, I always had a dream that that was going to be the one that was going to take off, and that it was going to, everything was going to change, and there was going to be this different feeling. But I wish that somebody gave me a little bit more guidance on the idea that it's really important to not peak too soon.
Mhm.
That when you're younger, even if you were able to achieve, what you might think is success at that moment, it, it might not be the same understanding of what success is as you get a little bit older, and maybe the older you get, the more what you're looking for becomes sophisticated. So it's kind of nice to be able to achieve things over a longer period of time. It doesn't look like any child actors are having a particularly great life,
Mhm.
and it's certainly, and in the same way, it doesn't look like anybody who's won the lottery, their life is measurably better off because they now have that money. I think that there's something that comes along with these feelings of having earned it.
Well, it's interesting. I heard that it's coming to mind that I've heard that piece of advice once before, um, which was someone, I guess, that was concerned that me and a friend of mine might have been peaking too early, which was when I was just a little bit after my 17th birthday. Me and a good friend of mine did a long trip for about 3.5 months around the U.S. In a van.
Mm-hmm.
And we were visiting with a family friend of my friend's who was a very interesting guy. He had been like a speechwriter for one of the U.S. presidents. I can't remember who, um, but we were we spent a few days with him that were a lot of fun um, at his house in Florida, and we were sort of like just really just having drinks and conversation and food and stuff. And
Right.
we were
Being
heading
wild.
off
Yeah.
in the next couple of days to go to Miami Rolling Loud, which is like this crazy multi-day music festival, hip hop music festival. And we were telling him all about the agenda that we had for the next few months. This was towards the beginning of our trip, and um, he was like, I think maybe what he was worried about was that we had put so many of our resources as a 17-year-old into this trip, and maybe he was concerned that we hadn't thought very much about the future beyond this trip.
Mm-hmm. Was
Which
he
was
accurate? Yeah.
well, I actually don't think it was accurate, but it was a concern. I mean, we met another guy in New Orleans who was like, um, people definitely seemed to have a perception of us that we were doing something irresponsible. um, But
But to your you described the Batman movies,
mhm,
and clearly the allegory that those Batman movies are trying to say is that if you keep the rope, you also won't get the full experience,
right.
right? So you've got the closer you get to the edge, the more likely it is that you feel that you're taking it all in at full capacity.
Yeah.
And the Batman movies had a very interesting way of being able to use fear as a way that it's an excellent allegory. Those are beautiful
They're
movies,
so good.
and in my opinion, they're what every superhero movie should be. Just
Mhm.
a really clever allegory for us to be able to look at the way that as individuals we function, but also how do those same patterns play themselves out in large scale social structures,
I mean, the first
which
one is literally the hero's journey, right?
Christopher Nolan, in my opinion, is just a genius.
Yeah.
I'm going to participate and appreciate everything that man makes. He's brilliant. So, but in the end, the experiences that you've had where you have put it all out on the line, or you're on a ragged edge and you're doing something, but you did it anyways. Those moments, I would assume, are probably some of the moments that you look back on really fondly.
Yeah.
I don't think that, making the right decision is has anything to do with playing it safe.
Mhm.
Sometimes the right decision is definitely to take the risk.
Right.
But I do think that you have to slow down, and you have to be very clear on what the reward is. Because if you're taking a risk and you don't understand what the reward is, then you could potentially be wasting your time.
I think one of the other interesting things about that trip, because it was definitely something that was, contributed to, you know, the person that I became during and after that time, um, was that it felt fun. It felt like an adventure, but it honestly didn't particularly feel like a risk. I mean, I think that maybe at the time when we were, 16, 17, that we were probably overestimating our own ability, but I mean, we were in a really interesting position where, in our sophomore year, we were out of school because of COVID, and so we just started working and we decided to do these sort of like early graduation programs.
Mhm.
And the amount of money that we spent on that road trip really wasn't a significant amount of the money that we had been able to make. And um, so I think to everyone else, it looked like we were doing something really, really stupid. But in our minds, we were actually sort of planning it out as being this thing that was going to be a tremendous spiritual growth for us.
Mhm.
And we really kind of wanted to turn it into a hero's journey. I don't know if the hero's journey was an archetype that I was aware of at the time, but it was kind of, we did have an intention in the trip. Although I would also say that the intention was probably to get away from home and have fun and be in an unsupervised environment.
Yeah.
But it was a 100% a transformative experience for me, and has turned into, my love for travel, which I think is one of the things I'm most grateful for, is not being afraid to go and do those things, because I think ultimately most people, at least in the United States, have the resources to travel more than they do. Um, and I know a lot of people who seem to be afraid to put themselves out there, which I think, coming back to the our Batman thing, it's like, I think the more that you can lean into things that feel a little bit outside of your comfort zone, that's where the growth is, which is another theme that comes up for us a lot,
Yeah. That you have to have discomfort before you can have growth.
right?
The Yeah, what was coming up for me as you were saying that, Oliver, is that I think that it's imperative that we come back to something that you and I can talk about feeling like is the truth. And one of the things that I was thinking as you were saying that is that I think you're absolutely right. Like the risk that you took when you were 17 or 18 years old to have very little money and still be on a trip where you were trying to do that. I'm might be filling in some gaps here. Maybe you had a ton of money and I'm not unaware of it. But most people when they go on those sort of young adventures, they're doing it in a very scrappy way.
It was definitely scrappy.
But I think the thing, money is a very, very low risk because you can always make more of it, and it can always be lost for other reasons that's not always within your control, right? If you're really, really tight with money, you're probably not going to live a life with a tremendous amount of financial prosperity. I'm not saying that you can't. There are plenty of people who are very tight with their money and they collect it little bit by little bit, and then they end up having, an abundance by the time they're done. That's not uncommon, obviously, but it's also, you lose a lot of time and experiences when you end up thinking that the money is your biggest risk. In my opinion, I would love to debate this or talk through it, but I can't see that there is a bigger risk to take than time. Is it worth giving up the time to go have this wild adventure when you're 17 than what you would have been doing otherwise if you didn't do it?
Right. Totally.
And that, man, we should be having that conversation way more often. I think I've told this story. I don't know if it was on a podcast or you and I have had this conversation, but I was a pretty low risk kid. I didn't do a ton of stuff where I think that I gave my parents a lot of heartache. It wasn't even a desire. Like, I wasn't looking to be wild. But I had a summer where I worked at a summer camp, and the counselor that I was working with was significantly older than I was. So I was like a sophomore or junior in high school, and she was like a sophomore in college. And the age gap was intoxicating to me. I just thought that this was like, she was an amazing human being. And I learned so much from her being around her. She was curious about so much. She was certainly intellectually superior to me. And so I just got to sit back and absorb. And she seemed to really enjoy me. I think I was curious and asked her questions that other people didn't ask her. So for whatever reason, we had a bond that got created, and it got created in small ways as we tried to manage these 16, 8-year-olds every day, which if you've ever done that, yeah, it's humbling and they're crazy. But it was, there was some bonding there. And then at this summer camp, there used to be all of these parties that you could go to for the counselors. And so I started going to those, and that was like a whole nother adventure. And then later on in the summer, she invited me to go to Burlington, Vermont with her and 2 other people. And I presented the idea to my parents. And my dad seems like, in his eyes, he seems cool with it. But my mom was like, absolutely not. 0% chance that you can do this. And it was the very first time in my whole life where I had to be like, is she right or am I right? Because I'm pretty much sure that this is going to be an amazing experience for me. And I ended up I just went to my dad and said, like, hey, listen, I know mom is going to go bananas when I leave, but like, I'm leaving. And I apologize for whatever you have to deal with on the other end of this, but like, I'll see you in 2 or 3 days. And I took off. And I don't know if I have the story exactly right, but I'm pretty sure my mom made my dad drive to Burlington, Vermont. Like the 2 of them, and I have a sister who is much younger than me, and I think that the 3 of them went to Burlington, Vermont, and got a hotel room, and so that they could like be nearby if something went wrong, which is crazy now that I think about it.
Right.
But but it ended up being one of the best weekends of my life. It was the first weekend that I had ever drank, which has not been something that has been, not something that I've picked up after that I really enjoyed all that much. But that weekend, it was an adventure to do that with them. It was an adventure to feel a little bit buzzy in a way that I never had, and just to let the world be happening in this really magical way. And it was probably one of the best weekends of my life, 40 plus years of my life. And I would say that is at the top of my weekends.
Well, it's a good feeling, right? When you're certain that you're gonna, when you're certain about anything, right?
There was a knowing that I just felt like I can't let this get away from me. But it also comes back to me often when I have to think about parenting my kids. And when my sons bring things to me that they want to do, I have to really open up my lens to be like, okay, is this a moment where I'm going to stifle your ability to have an amazing experience? Or is this a moment where I need to see that you can't see that there's something dangerous here that you don't know about? That there's something that's outside of your ability to be able to perceive because you just haven't had as much life experience. And I found that it doesn't, that when I talk through it with them, we all come to reasonable conclusions together. And sometimes those conclusions lean a little bit more towards allowing them to have the adventure that they feel like they're ready for. And sometimes it leans a little bit more towards them being like, okay, I'll pull back a little bit. But it has been trying to share my truth with them as honestly as I can that I feel like allows that to happen. And maybe even more importantly, because my mom was very honest with me growing up and was a very honest person in general, but that was the first time where we had a conflict of what was right and what was wrong, and being able to have to go through that process of being like, man, can I make these decisions for myself?
Hmm.
Who is the person who needs to make this decision? And I would argue, even as a parent, that it's the individual person.
Yeah.
You got to trust your instincts at some point, and if you make a mistake, you got to own them.
I think what it's making me think of is that that parenting thing that you were talking about, where you're talking about like, from years 0 to 7, putting that unconditional love there. From years 7 to 14, trying to drill in and enforce a sense of discipline, and then from 14 to 21, it's kind of like, how can you be there and let a kid make their own decision about something and learn. Um, and
And
yeah.
just for context, because I think we talked about that in one of the podcasts, that's not my theory. That was something that somebody shared with me when I was working as a facilitator, and we just had we had a sidebar conversation that ended up getting into conversation about being men and being fathers and what that all means. And he happened to be from the Middle East, and he was sharing, we were sharing cultural differences with each other, and that came out of that conversation. And I just found it to be profoundly beautiful.
Yeah.
And it really changed and I don't know how old. My younger son was definitely under 7 when I heard that,
Yeah.
but my older son had already elapsed that. So I remember though coming home from that and immediately sitting down with both of my sons and being like, this is what I learned. I think that this is correct. I'm going to do my best to be able to get there. I'm going to do my best to, to uphold these from here on out. And had a very honest conversation with my older son on where I thought maybe I had missed that at different times and for different reasons. And that was also very helpful to have that conversation.
Well, it's making me think of, when you were asking me about what I think my potential is and how I might be different as a version of myself that had reached that. I do think about discipline a lot, and I think that and this is something that I think is a good thing, but I think that maybe in my upbringing, for whatever reason, the structure of my family, the fact that I'm the youngest, or just whatever was going on in the lives of everyone in my family while I was being raised, I think maybe we missed that middle step, and we just went straight from at 7 years old, like you're gonna, you can figure it out, and so I think that that's allowed me to feel confident in my ability to make my own mind up about things. But the discipline side of things is definitely something that I haven't. I'm still working on finding that balance. Where exactly that is, definitely not something that I think was instilled in me at a young age.
I think every generation of parents has done this, Oliver, and it appears like I don't know. I was about to say like it's getting better, but I don't know if that's true. It just might be different based on technology. But you know, parenting is complicated because it's like a form of gardening. You know what I mean? You're planting seeds, and then you have to water them and try to nurture and nurture and nurture until you see something that's got strong roots and is in good shape. And then you have to move on to another territory of your garden and start figuring out how you're allowing that to grow and move forward. But the thing that's really, changed, at least in what it feels like from what I remember being parented versus trying to figure out how to be a parent, is there's a totally different relationship with boredom. I remember parents of the generation that I was growing up. There was sort of this collective agreement amongst the parents that the best thing to do was to send your kids out and to have them be out adventuring.
Hmm.
And then when later on having my own kids, started to find like, man, it feels like that has shifted 100%. Like it's really difficult to find other parents who want to let their kids out.
Right.
And that might have also just been that I lived in a community where it was less inviting to allow that to happen, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like the conversations were getting more and more specific about what was dangerous and less specific about why it could be dangerous to not have adventure.
Well, it's interesting. I obviously don't have the perspective of a parent, but I do remember as a kid with parents who I think did have that mindset about adventure. I had I would say one really close friend whose parents were absolutely on the same page, and so um, you know that was really great, or maybe two. But I remember having other friends whose parents were the complete polar opposite of that, and I remember as like a little 9 or 10 year old having like a vivid hatred for these parents,
Mm.
which I think was purely out of selfish reasons or perhaps a feeling of injustice at not being able to do the things that I wanted to do when I was in the presence of those parents in their world with those friends.
Mm.
Um, and not me having conversations with myself about what's the best parenting approach. But yeah, I don't know where how that where that balance is or how that changes over time with the new world that we're living in, but it's definitely perhaps one of the most important conversations in general is about parenting, and that's one of the one of the pillars of that, of trying to reach an understanding of that.
Well, it strikes me that we should always be looking for how now is the best opportunity, right? Like, I don't think that humans evolve all that quickly. I don't think that's a profound hot take. Like, I think that the way that our systems work, the way that our mind works, the way that our body works has essentially worked the same way over a really long period of time. But it does appear that there is there is research that has been done, and it looks like there's going to be a ton of compelling evidence that epigenetics are real and
Hmm.
that you can
Yeah.
actually change your own genes by going through a series of transformational processes within your own psyche and within your own body, where you begin to heal yourself to the point where your genes change, and then you're passing on those um, you know, that version of your genes if you choose
Yeah,
to.
you pass on, I think, a higher potential for the genes to get expressed in your lifetime.
Yeah, the way that I've heard people describe it that made a lot of sense to me is that, like, your genes are essentially a series of light switches that create the spectrum of what's on and what's off and
Mhm.
what's easy and what's hard and what is available and unavailable. And just in your subconscious level, those switches are either on or off. There's not a lot that you can do with them, but if you could figure out how to identify each one of those and bring it up to a conscious level where you are actually changing your actions on a day-to-day basis, you are adjusting things all the time, you could actually start to practice your way into allowing things to change in your body, in your mind, and then therefore theoretically you'd be changing your genes and you'd be passing on those
Right.
genes to the next generation.
I think one of the interesting parts of that conversation that's coming to mind for me is that it seems obvious to me that the potential for that is going to diminish over time. And that, if you're practicing things that are going to change which genes are active or not, and you activate a certain gene as a kid, that's going to have a much more tremendous, effect on the outcomes of your life and your abilities than if you do so later in life.
Yeah.
But that often, or perhaps always as a kid, someone else is making the decision of what you should be instead of you making that decision, which isn't, necessarily a bad thing, right? Like if we want to agree that all of our kids should be creative and disciplined and compassionate, and we want to try and activate genes that we think align with those values, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think that it's interesting to think that, the ultimate expression of this, trying to use epigenetics is for someone to decide what they want to be so that they can work towards being that. But that, so we need to try and focus on trying to, I think maybe that in traditional education systems that there's not enough focus on individuals actually having deep contemplation about what it is they want for themselves. um, and I think that, you know the more that we can try and encourage that conversation, that the more people will be able to utilize these new ideas and theories that are coming out. I went to a charter school, River Valley in Newburyport, which was, I think, is also probably largely responsible for the fact that I have felt in my life that I have been having that conversation with myself.
Yeah.
But I do think that that's not part of the traditional education system as much as it should be.
No, it is. All right. So I think it's really important that for wherever this conversation goes, Oliver, that we have to get one level deeper into it by just assessing between the two of us, between our two perspectives, whether we both believe that you can't prevent yourself from being programmed.
Hmm.
So the version of Oliver that we got because you went to that charter school is likely a different version of Oliver that I would be talking to if you had gone to another a more traditional
Vastly
environment.
different.
Vastly different, right? So the most important decision we can all make is to identify the primary values that everyone can align with, and then make sure that those are at the absolute center of everything that we're doing from an educational standpoint.
Right.
Because whatever is the alternative to those values that's currently being taught is also what is currently becoming our reality.
Well, that's interesting because I know, obviously that uh, everything that we're doing here is based on, or everything, I should say rather, that we're doing for the unscripted room and for the curiosity mindset game is based around the 9 sort of like core values.
Right.
But at the charter school, we had a different version of that, which was, I don't remember how many there were, but they were all C words. So there was like curiosity was definitely one of them. Creativity was definitely one of them. I think citizenship was one of them. And so it is. It's just interesting because I kind of forgot that we had we had that at the charter school,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm not aware of. You know what the public school approach to that is if they
Yeah.
have their own version of that or not. But I
So
definitely agree with what you're saying with it being principled and,
well,
and incorporating that in the
but
education.
we also have to be careful too. Like I've experienced this with trying to get businesses up and going, where there was times that I've had businesses where I'm like, ooh, I like that tagline. I like, you know, But did I believe in what was on the other end of it, or was it just something that I thought was going to be appealing enough to somebody else to be able to allow me to accomplish whatever it was that I was doing? Was it marketing, or was it something that I integrated into the experience that I was delivering in a way where people could actually feel that value in everything that we're doing?
Mhm.
And I think education is a really great example of that. Now, this charter school sounds like they did an amazing job of integrating their value system into the experience that you had. So shout out to them.
Yeah.
I would love to have them on the podcast.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah.
I'd love to learn from them. I'd love to learn about what their philosophies are and why they're doing it, and what are the limitations to being able to offer the way that they teach to the masses. Is there something that would prevent us from taking this technique and allowing it to be more applicable to communities that don't have it currently? But ultimately, I think that we have to stop thinking about information as the core opportunity of learning, and I think we have to make values the core opportunity of learning, which kind of gets back to this idea that we have put so much value on the scientific part of our experience, and that has made us sort of undervalue the education of the spiritual side of ourselves. And I feel comfortable talking about this because I didn't grow up in a spiritual household. I grew up where, at best, I would say my parents considered themselves agnostic. And at times, I would say that my mom would probably self-describe herself as an atheist. And she talked to me about it all the time. You know what I mean? It's not like she was hiding anything. We would, from a very young age, I would be sitting at the kitchen counter and she would just be talking to me like I was an adult, which I'm so grateful for now.
Mhm.
It made such a big difference in my ability to be able to try to find my mindset. But in the end, if we don't educate ourselves to core values, then we go adrift, right? And once you start getting into information, like the kind of information that you learn in school, I remember, you know, just think about the number of history classes that you took, and then you think about the books that were in those history classes and who wrote those books, and did they have, what was the perspective in which those books were written. And even in my lifetime, that has probably gone from like, these books were written by the winners of this situation, and then that became offensive, and then somebody else would come in with another book that's written from another perspective, and then that just becomes sort of not the full story either.
Mhm. Yeah.
And in the end, whatever the story is not nearly as important as the values we can learn from them. Which is why I oftentimes think, like, man, if I could just go back and read children's fables, like, you could pretty much learn most of the truth that you need to know about the world by reading the basic children's stories.
Right.
If you understand the allegory, it's actually one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson, who I think is such a just an absolute gift to thinking, and somebody who I am so grateful exists in this world and that I've been able to learn so much from.
Yeah.
But the way that he has gone back, and I've listened to quite a bit of stuff that he's done in both being able to break down children's stories in the way that he makes it much more clear the values that they were trying to allow you to be able to absorb from those stories. And same with spiritual text, the Bible.
Totally.
I've also listened to him and other really intelligent people, break down both those spiritual documents as something that is fun to consider as, in a literal sense of, like, was there a great flood? Was there an ark that had to be built?
Well-
Did civilization go down to very few people and had to rebuild itself?
One of the things that this is taking me in the direction of is that I think fundamentally the true thread, or the through thread rather, with those things, is it takes us back to one of the first things that you mentioned, which is Jung and his archetypes, which is really fascinating stuff. And I think it's interesting, with your perspective on history, which is like the values are I think maybe just as important as all of the information, and maybe more. I guess no, actually, I would agree that the values are more important. I don't want to dismiss the importance of whatever facts there are as well, but I think it's really interesting, when you look at things like the Bible, and I've heard those Jordan Peterson analyses as well, where there's, I think what's really interesting about a lot of those things is that God is often in the Old Testament, at least, is often portrayed as being the sort of the animating spirit, and so in each different story, God is really more representative of values of, in this story, God means to be compassionate or to be a citizen or to take on this kind of thought process. And so when you say you're worshiping, you're saying, we're upholding these values in this story.
Yeah.
It's these archetypal things that come up over and over again, that are maybe some of the, if we want to call them archetypes, are probably very, very similar to spiritual truth. They are literally based on shared experience. And so when you're talking about something like the flood, whether it's a flood or a fire or a drought or whatever it is, I think that the flood is a very universal experience, and that maybe there was something in ancient human history where sea levels changed and that was experienced and found its way into, cultures around the world. But even if that's not true, the experience of some massive natural event beyond our control that's going to make our lives increasingly more difficult and tragic, that's every single living creature, from the conception of life on Earth, it has that experience, right? And it's interesting the way that there's all of these shared tropes. Like one we talk about a lot is the hero's journey. That's a sort of like a story, an archetype within storytelling. And Dr. Seuss is so I think is the epitome of this kind of thing. I remember loving Dr. Seuss as a kid, but then going back and being like, wow, not only do all of these lessons, like these are real, but that I can even go back and be like, oh, I know why this book is my favorite, or rather, the fact that this book was my favorite might have actually had a real difference in my life, which is, I remember my favorite one was, did you ever read McGilligan's Pool?
I don't think so.
Was this great story where there's this little kid and he's fishing in basically what looks like a pond, and everyone tells him, you're not gonna catch anything in that pond, and then the entire rest of the book is like page after page of all of these places around the world that this pond connects to, and it's just I think the theme is that. I think the theme is primarily about trusting yourself and not letting other people tell you where you're going to find success, which is just, if you look, every single one of those stories has these kinds of lessons that you're like, wow, like I'm not necessarily sure if when I was a kid and I was reading McGilligan's Pool or, the north-facing Zach and the south-facing Zach, that one's about I mean, that's just a classic. It's almost about, it makes me think about, about righteousness, but really what it's about is about compromise, right? And every single one of those Dr. Seuss stories has baked into it sort of like an archetypal truth, a shared experience in humanity that we've established over and over again, like, hey, this is something that's worth knowing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a gift that gets passed down, right? And the more creative you can create a story that allows it to be something that's fun, while simultaneously making sure that you leave with something that's deeply embedded, maybe even deeply embedded in your subconscious, is probably the difference between what has a profound effect and what has a surface effect, right? So if you're reading the same book over and over again when you're a child and you are deeply interested in this book and you're so inspired by it, it's very unlikely that you're thinking about the deeper meaning behind it. But that doesn't matter because somehow it's seeping into your subconscious, that deeper meaning.
Yeah.
And later on, you might be able to, like you are now, you might be able to discover at 22 the meaning that you didn't understand at 10. The other thing that I don't know a ton about this, Oliver, but I would just say that I've been able to scratch the surface of my personal understanding, but I'm very, very excited. One of the things that I'm hoping comes out of the podcast is that we get more and more people who have deep scientific backgrounds so that I
Yeah.
can ask all the questions that I have, especially ask it to people who I can look in their eyes and I can see whether the answer that they're giving is because they're also curious or whether I'm getting an answer that's because they have been indoctrinated to think that they're right. And those are two very different things.
Mhm.
But I'm really curious, like what happens to us at puberty? Is that when, as a parent, I've definitely noticed from watching my own sons go through this very clear biological metamorphosis that one of the things that seems to change and maybe the critical change beyond all of the things that we focus on about, sort of this awakening of some sort of sexual energy that happens at puberty, but it also seems to be the awakening of self-consciousness. It seems to be the first time where you go from having sort of this like playful view of yourself as being this anything, everything's an opportunity. Everything is, when you're reading the books, you can imagine yourself being on that adventure and being a part of that storyline, and your imagination is at a different peak. And then something happens in puberty where we have to switch over biologically to start seeing the world for the way that it really is, not getting overly stuck in the fantasy of what we hope it could be.
Right. Well,
And that sense of self, causes us to go through a lot of things. It also does seem to be the birth of the moment where you find out that you're starting to have sexual preferences, and whether that's, a man for a woman for a man for a man, a woman for a woman, whatever version of that it is, it seems to be happening at that time too, which is also there's a lot there, right? There's just a lot that goes into all of that. So.
I think I can, from my limited understanding, offer a sort of a perspective on that, which comes from Freud, which is the Freud, talks about a lot about the id, the ego and superego, which is like id is like your most basic needs. When you're a baby, that's all you have. You cry and you're uncomfortable, and then you get the thing, and wait, so on and so forth. And then your ego comes from, the thoughts and ideas and things that you associate with yourself. But that a massive driver of that is also about how you're perceived in a group. A lot of the things about how you perceive yourself come from how the group perceives you. And then superego is supposed to be, more related to basing your identity around how much you can contribute to the group. So instead of basing your identity on whether you have what you need or not, as an id, as a kid, as like an infant, to basing your identity on what you and the group think about yourself, that, then the sort of parenting superego comes out that bases your identity on how much you can contribute to society. And I don't understand enough to go into more depth about that, but I think that one of the really interesting things about tying that together with puberty is that I think maybe that it's around that time of puberty that you're shifting more from, and these are all, as like we were saying in the language and thinking episode, these are very, broad terms that are useful, but they don't show you the nuance. It's like id, ego, superego allow you to have a conversation about these complicated things, but usually you have to drill in further to find the meaning in things. What's interesting about, the puberty is that as you're finding that you have more, social desire to you know, find mating or find mates or whatever it is, right? You're thinking much more about the way that you're perceived in a group than you ever were before. Um, and I think that as humans, so much of what we do, and we don't necessarily have conscious awareness of this, is that we're trying to build ourselves to be good enough for someone else to decide to share their life with. And I think that that starts to really take effect in your own mindset around the time of puberty, where you don't necessarily realize, when you're 13, that you want to be cool. You want to be cool when you're 13. That's the most important thing, is that you have to be cool. I remember, getting into middle school in 7th grade, had this really long hair uh, that I just hadn't cut for years because I got my earlobe cut when I was getting my hair cut once, and it really turned me off that. But I was like, 7th grade hit, and I was like, I have to be cool. I'm gonna get like a short haircut like everyone else. And in my own mind, like, I knew that I wanted to be cool in 7th grade. But I don't think, that I was consciously aware of the fact that that's I believe that that's part of a larger dynamic that you have, to say, I want to actually be perceived as valuable and desirable, and that a lot of the things that we do, like trying to build a career, um, trying to build all of the attributes that we think are positive attributes, are part of our, our, at least part of that is coming from a desire for those to be perceived as valuable traits in like a mating environment. And that all starts to happen around puberty, I think.
Yeah. I don't know, there's so many interesting discussions around this concept, because I mean, just one of the things that I was thinking at the very end was that it's going to be imperative that we start having a conversation, maybe directly with teenagers as they're starting to go through puberty, or maybe it's with parents who are trying to parent that age group, that the what we're trying to look forward to is the potential that we have. But you can't get stuck in thinking that what you currently have right now is enough. It's like this weird dichotomy in the human experience, is that you inherently are enough because you're alive, and the idea that you're alive gives you infinite opportunity of what you can do with the time that you have left. Maybe infinite, maybe not for everybody. Maybe there's degrees of that. But if you believe that you have the choice to be able to turn your life into whatever you want, then you could start making the choices that are available to you right now to move in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
But it also is really important that we don't treat each other as if the way that you spend your time is equal. Right? So if you're a teenager and you really haven't had the opportunity to be able to learn how to become great at something, to practice something to the degree where you're finding real success with it, then it's massively to your detriment if you have people that are telling you that that undershooting your potential is somehow okay.
Yeah.
Because that potential is you. You know what I mean? There's probably no more generous way of being able to describe a human than to be able to evaluate the depth of their potential.
Well,
and everybody's potential is different. It's not going to be the same, and it's actually the difference that is probably the cure to everything that we need, is that we don't need everybody to be good at everything. We need everybody to be good at what they're good at.
One of the interesting things coming to mind is the thing you said earlier about a child being kind of like a garden, or something like that. When you go and you want to plant a tree or put things in your garden, you buy a seed, and you 100% value on it for what it has the potential to become. You are not really even concerned at all, other than in what you can provide to it in the present for what it is now. Like, it's practically what you buy, its value is only in the future. It's sort of interesting.
Right, which is what you just described, Oliver, is probably a really great way to think about the way that we should build systems. I was working on this morning before we came on to do this. I am working on making sure that I create a very defined structure for the way that we build the questions that go into an entire season of the Unscripted Room.
Yeah.
So that every episode is actually picking up on the potential of what was unscripted about the episode before it. So the only thing in those podcasts that we're actually doing that give us some sort of ability to be able to define the guardrails towards an outcome is the 3 questions that we use.
Mm-hmm.
The first one focusing on, conversations of our past, the middle one about our present, and then the last one always sort of our anchor question about our vision for the future. But I've been really trying to figure out how I can be extremely specific with question 1 and question 2 to make sure that they are always allowing us to be able to have this organic unfolding of interesting conversation. And then wherever the assumption is of that conversation, can we pick it up in the next episode? And then can we pick it up? And then can we have all 18 episodes be that arc of experience that a listener would have so that they're seeing sort of the arc of human potential and growth happening through these series of conversations. That is the same thing as, a question is planting a seed.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was working on the questions for episode 7, I think, which is experiences with nature. Am I right on that?
Yes.
So one of the things that I was considering as I was doing that is, the obvious part of that episode is that it's about the relationship that people have with the difference between the relationship that you might have with nature and with animals versus the relationship that you might have with humans. There's one sort of potential, but I was really curious about going a layer deeper than this and saying, one of the things that nature offers us and having a beautiful relationship with nature is that nature is a great place to be able to observe systems.
Oh, yeah.
There's nothing that exists by itself. Everything requires something else. So if you plant a tree, that tree will go down into the ground and its roots won't sustain itself alone. It will start to take nutrients from everything that's around it. It will, it will become symbiotic with everything that is in the area in which it's working.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the more deeply you start to appreciate the way that nature works, it probably is an opportunity for us also to see that there are social systems that operate in almost exactly the same way. And I would argue that to be able to understand those social systems, it's really important that you understand yourself first. Because once you get the degree of self-awareness and you uncover your own patterns, it's much easier to understand how social patterns start to exist at scale that are essentially just an amplified version of what you are experiencing as a singular entity.
Mm-hmm.
But that nature is a really beautiful way to be able to kind of pass the observation from one system to another. You know what I mean? If I understand why the natural world operates in this way, does that give me at least a really strong thinking reference point to be able to figure out why a social system would also operate in this way? And where do we find the connective tissue between those?
Right.
I just think that there's so much relationship between all of these things that the more we get people talking, I think we're going to find some really interesting connections that other people have made that I've never thought of before, and I'm down for it. You know what I mean? I love it when somebody brings a thought to the table that I've never had, and then you get to dig in and start to explore.
The one thing that's coming to mind for me, and I absolutely agree that when someone says something and you're like, whoa, hold on a second, never been down that road before.
Yeah.
Like, okay, like, let's go. But so one of the things that's coming to mind for me in terms of examining the systems in nature and trying to apply that socially is there's this really interesting specific type of gardening that people do if we want to follow the gardening thread. I can't remember what this is called, but people will put together these sort of like wild gardens where they take a plot of land and they say, on this plot of land, we're just going to scatter a bunch of seeds for, cherry trees and tomatoes and cucumbers and these kinds of flowers and stuff. And they pick a combination of things that naturally have been shown to sort of be symbiotic to each other, and they don't trim, they don't do anything else, or what they do is very minimal in terms of the maintenance of these things. And so they just take a bunch of things that they know, if these flowers, flower at this time and then the petals fall off and those will compost and give nutrition, and nutrients to these other things, and that these plants will actually draw the bugs away from them, and that these plants are actually okay. It kind of works for their strategy if the bugs eat them, but that we're going to have these so that the bugs don't eat these other plants. And it's a really sort of beautiful idea. And I think that maybe the way that you extend that, or the obvious way that's coming to mind for me is in terms of team building. How do you create, the right balance of people where you're going to say, oh, this person is going to be the person who has, all these kinds of ideas, and this person's going to be the person who's very organized, and these people are going to be the people who have the social expertise, and these people are going to be the ones who have the technical expertise, and how can we find a mix that's actually not just going to allow this to work, but that all of these different people together actually help each other grow, like a garden does.
I can tell you how you can increase your ability to not make your team work, which is to not know what the outcome is that you're actually trying to reach.
Right.
So if you aren't giving people a really clear vision and a really clear purpose as to why the time that they're investing, whether that's creative time or whether that's functional time, or break that down in any way that you want. If they don't understand why that time has value to reaching the ultimate goal, it's way more likely that that team is not going to function at a high level, right?
Right.
So I would say fundamentally, it's awareness. It's, is everybody completely aware of, what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and feels like every day they wake up and they feel the effects of their time on that outcome. Everything else we can get technical, because this is my area of expertise. So I don't mind getting technical on everything else, but at the very root of it, that fundamentally is the number one thing that that you need is you need leadership that has an idea of inspiration.
Yeah.
And then you need to be able to communicate that idea of inspiration as accurately as you can. The idea that on a day-to-day basis, everybody's going to be operating at peak efficiency is unrealistic.
Right.
But if everybody is operating, and they're hitting peak efficiency some days and a little bit off on other days, and there's some fluctuation, but everybody always knows that they're working in an environment where their peak efficiency is going towards something they believe in.
Right.
That's a massive advantage to any team.
If they want to be at peak efficiency versus, a lot of times, and myself included in this, especially when I was younger and I was working for places that I didn't care at all, or care about, what was the output of the team. It's like, well, maybe then my mindset becomes far more about how do I get through the day without expending more energy than I have to, right? If you don't care about the outcome. And unfortunately, one of the, I don't know, maybe I wonder how much hospitals and stuff try and do the kind of training that your company does. I think honestly that they might stand to benefit from it a tremendous amount, because I remember when I was working at a hospital being very surprised that it was kind of the same as working in a restaurant, where I found that working in restaurants, many people were just putting in the bare minimum amount of effort. How do I get out at the end of the shift and not feel completely drained?
Mm-hmm.
And I would have, I had expected at the hospital that I worked at, for that to not be the case, that people understood that what they were doing was so important that they were going to do it to the best of their ability. Um, and I think it's just so interesting that the management there is doing such a bad job at making people feel inspired, because what they are doing is tremendously important. But for people to not feel that way, they must be doing very little in terms of, team building, inspiration. And it might be that, that once the curiosity mindset game is up, that maybe that's one of the communities that we could look at trying to introduce it to, that it might be super beneficial.
So I know for sure that it would be beneficial, not necessarily our process, you know what I mean? Because I don't want to overplay that we've got some solution that is the only solution. You get good at anything that you practice. So if you're practicing positive behaviors, which is what I would hope most training organizations are focused on, is helping people build more positive behaviors into their day to day. But I will say, I was married to a nurse, somebody who I had still have the utmost respect for her as a human being, but also for her professional capabilities. She was an
Right.
extraordinary nurse. And I was so fascinated talking to her all the time, because I just admired how good she was at what she did. But she used to tell me all the time that the training in the healthcare industry was way, way worse than the training in the automotive industry. That the automotive
Yeah.
industry actually spent a lot more time and money training their sales, service, and parts teams
Mm-hmm.
to be excellent at what they do than she had ever experienced in, as being a very high level nurse. And she was working in, PICUs and ER, like the places where, this is the highest level of pressure that you can have in that industry. And the training was apparently pretty transactional.
Oh yeah.
And
Even my limited experiences of the training that I did for security was absolutely my experience.
the other thing that was really interesting about being able to observe that industry from the outside, but from somebody's perspective that I trusted, was that you also there was a tremendous amount of evidence that you could get better outcomes by having better, what I would refer to as soft skills.
Mm-hmm.
So your ability to be able to have to think critically, but also to be able to communicate that critical thinking to somebody in a way that makes them feel like they're a part of what's happening, not that they're at the mercy of what's about to happen. Because the anxiety in those particular work environments is so high, because the level of authority is so high, and the level of trust also has to be so high.
Right.
But I'm not sure that those organizations have earned our trust enough to be able to give it quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, one thing that I was thinking earlier when you were saying that, though, is above all else, what I will say, and if anybody listens to this podcast, this is the number one thing that I would say that I've learned in, both a career as a trainer, but also in, building a business that is endeavoring to try to create what we believe is our most creative and imaginative form of training for large, small organizations. But it's that you cannot solve culture from the bottom up. You can only solve culture from the top down. And that for any organization, this could be an athletics team, it could be a hospital, it could be a car dealership, it could be anything that you want to apply this to. Excellence usually exists when you find as close to perfect balance as you can between process and culture. So too much process, too much like you've got to fill out this form, then you've got to do this, then you got to do this, then you got to do this. And it becomes like you are imprisoned in, in the mundane process that you're in. But then on the other side, if you allow there to be so much culture where it's like, it's just about us having a great time all the time, like, yeah, then you also miss the fact that there needs to be delayed gratification where you get things done right so that you don't end up having to go back and do them over and over and over again. And the balance that you're looking for is this like ability to allow everybody to be their best individual self, but work within an organization where the processes are very clear to make sure that everything can be, if it's done well once, that there is something put in place to make sure that it can be done well twice and third time and fourth time, and then it only gets better the more it gets, that path gets worn.
Mm-hmm.
And but you can't build the culture half of that unless you have leadership who wants to build it. So if you end up in an organization, I've said this to my sons over and over and over again, like, whatever you choose to do with your career, if you get into an organization and your instincts are telling you that you don't believe in the person who's running the organization, leave immediately at whatever cost. Immediately. There will be nothing that will change. Your gut will remain the same. I'm saying when you know something. I'm not saying
Right.
you could come in and you could catch somebody having a bad day. Like, don't be reactive about it. But if you get in and you've observed everything and you've taken it all in and you've got that deep instinctual feeling that this is somebody who doesn't align with your value system, don't give that system any more of your time. Get out of there as quickly as you can. And the quicker you get out of there, the more likely it is that you're going to start finding something that does align with your system or a system that aligns with you or vice versa, right?
Because the second that you're in an environment that makes you feel, if you're in an environment where you feel inspired and where you believe in the outcome, that's going to bring out a better version of you. But if you're in an environment likewise where you don't believe in the outcome or the culture, you're going to probably start building some pretty bad patterns about the way that you carry yourself in your workplace.
So there's that. I think that there's even a deeper concern that everybody should have for themselves, which is that every day you'll be corrupting yourself just a little bit. If you
Right.
keep spending your time on something that you don't believe in, you will convince yourself that your time can be bought.
Mm.
And that is a very, very dangerous road to go down. You imprison your mind in this idea that you are, that you're willing to do something that you don't believe in exchange for cash.
Mhm.
And that is, that can be sold to you in so many different ways that it seems like it's not that. But in the end, if you're doing something that you don't believe in, you're working for an organization that has patterns and a way of doing something that you think is not in alignment with you, then every day you continue to work there is going to be a compromise to your soul. And if you don't come to terms with that, then you could give up way too much of your time and life to working on something you don't believe in. Now, on the other end, I would say to anybody who wants to be a leader, the opportunity is tremendous to be able to recognize that, what you are actually trying to do in a leadership position has a lot less to do with the success of your product and a lot more to do with the success of the individuals who are helping you build it. So if your primary focus as a leader was just to make sure that you're putting everybody in the organization in the best position for them to be able to reach their full potential, then in my opinion, that mathematically should work out to you being in the best position for your organization to be able to release the best product.
Right. And I mean, I think that people are coming around to that realization. I know, I've, um, it seems to be more of a thing now for people to have a wellness benefit. It's like, oh, wow, companies are finally realizing, hey, if your employees are healthy, physically healthy, that's going to improve the outcomes of your company. Which I think that the idea of a wellness benefit is a pretty new idea, but so it's encouraging to see that even large companies, like I believe Verizon does it. I don't know what other companies do it.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, listen, I would say for any company, anything that any company can do to try to think about the health, wealth, and prosperity of the people who work for them seems like that's a good investment.
Yeah.
But I would also warn people who work for companies to not think that benefits equals alignment with your values.
Right. You got to have both.
Because, well, it's a, I mean, think about the very low level, easy manipulation strategy is that if you wanted to offer people salary and incentives that was almost too good to resist, then once they come in and they've accepted that, then their ability to, to be able to think critically about their contribution to whatever you're doing is compromised by their desire to have.
Right.
So just like if a deal looks too good to be true, just examine it really carefully and make sure that it's not too good to be true. And that not, um, there's way too much to this world and to the opportunity of life and the time that we have to, I don't think that you have to follow your values at the compromise of your financial freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that the only way that you can get financial freedom is to compromise your values. If you're making one of those two things, if you're making it a push and pull between those two places, I would really slow down and consider that. Because I think that maybe the North Star for all of us should be, how can I reach financial freedom so that I have more freedom of my time to be able to, to offer my potential to the world more generously, at least on as generously as possible, because I'm free to use it in any way that I want,
Mm-hmm.
without having to do that by compromising myself. And by the time, if you have compromised yourself to get that freedom, then you're naturally going to build a barrier between you and everybody else, because you're going to feel like they resent you for it. Whereas if you do it in a way that allows, hopefully, everybody to be a part of it, then, if you're able to get to that point, hopefully you're able to celebrate the experience with other people.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm not financially free, so I don't. I'm still much more on the standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to make it work side. So I don't necessarily have proper perspective to be able to say absolutely whether one is true or the other. But I'm grateful for every experience that I have, and I certainly, my North Star is financial freedom, so that I get creative freedom, and then I would love to support as many people in achieving that exact same goal, because I think that that's got to be one of the best ways to live.
Right. I think one of the, going back to some spiritual truths, one of the things that I've been coming to think is true recently is just the idea that I guess really what it is well, I don't know. I'm going to tie it to a specific moment, which was yesterday. Yesterday I went to a concert with my parents at this really cool place, Jimmy's Jazz and Blues Club in Portsmouth, which I just have to say was awesome.
Nice.
And probably the coolest place to go out in the immediate area. Definitely, I would go there again, and I will go there again. But one of the things I was thinking was, I was there and I was seeing this really incredible performance, and in my mind, I want to be up there. I want to play there. Like, that's a goal that I have, is that I want to, in some capacity, whether it's for their band open mic nights that you have to submit auditions to, in some capacity that I want to go. And specifically, I want to play the like $300,000 Steinway that they have there.
Mm-hmm.
But I was also thinking my friend Ben would absolutely thrive in this environment, and that whatever I can do to get Ben here, I want to do that. And it's just really interesting, because then I had a thought, which is, I think that a younger version of myself if I were to go into an environment with a friend of mine and find that they were thriving in that environment more than I was, that I might be upset by that, or that I might think that I had made a mistake somehow, and that there's something I should do differently to make sure that I'm the one that's thriving in that environment. Whereas now I find myself thinking, wow, if I think that Ben could have so much potential in this specific place, I got to get Ben here. You know what I mean? Like,
Well-
which I just think, I'm not sure exactly what the way to articulate that truth in a concise way is, but I think you just have to try and uplift the people around you, I guess.
Yeah, well, I would also say though that it might be a sign of, some maturation in your honesty with yourself. Because if you're at that environment and you're like, wow, I could imagine myself, behind that piano, but to be honest, I know that my skills are not what this other person's skills are. I know that the talent that they have is at this moment, uniquely well positioned for this. Then the right thing to do would be to create the opportunity for the person who's most capable of being able to run with it. And that isn't always easy, right? Because sometimes you feel like, oh man, if I pass up this opportunity, I'll never get it again. But the truth is that if you send somebody in who's more capable of being able to take that opportunity, it's actually probably your best pathway to being able to get your opportunity, because now you have somebody who you have positive equity with in the door,
Yeah.
who now knows how the door works. And
Totally.
as you develop your skills to the same point, there's an opportunity for that to be able to, to come back. It fundamentally, I think, we're going to experiment with this, Oliver. We talk about it all the time. But, for everything that we're building specifically for the Unscripted room, but for all of everything that we're building, the Unscripted room, the Curiosity Mindset game, and then eventually the Curiosity community, we're going to attempt to not advertise it all, because the one thing that I've been struggling with for a long time is that I can no longer honestly tell the difference between marketing and manipulation.
Yep.
It's some people are so good at marketing that they find the absolute truth of a product and they present it with that. And I admire those people so deeply. And those are the greatest marketers in the world. But a lot of the marketing that's happening is a subtle, like, can I understand where I can catch you in an algorithm, hit you in the, I don't know, whatever that all is that it is, we talk about each other as if we're commodities, not as if I'm like, man, can I link Oliver up with something that I know would benefit him? How can I figure out how to do that? So we're going to build everything that we do off of word of mouth. But we're also going to experiment with trying to figure out, like, maybe the best way to be able to build our product is by promoting anyone that experiences our product. Just, so if we do a podcast and we have really interesting people, how can we give a shout out to Rosa and help her build her business? How can we
get people to go in and see Nina's art studio?
Exactly. So how, and if we just experimented with the idea of not needing anything to come back to us, will we, because it feels like we're doing the right thing by promoting people that we believe in, will that naturally kind of have the effect where it allows more people to want to gravitate towards what it is that we're trying to do? I think that it's probably likely that is the case. And I want to be very honest with you, Oliver. Like, I don't make any decisions with our business that I don't think is in our best interest. So I think that I'm the most compassionate I've ever been in my whole life, and I'm very, very grateful to genuinely feel like I'm somebody who was born with a personality where I want the best for everybody. That has not always worked out for me, because sometimes I see the best in people and then I blind myself to the reality of the other things that I should be seeing. So I've learned how to hone that a little bit and make sure that I'm a little bit more careful with the way that I use it. But I am definitely not interested in doing right by other people that has no positive effect for us.
Right.
Like, we can't go out of business
to support other businesses.
Exactly.
Right.
That would be
Well, this is just the one thought that I'm having about that is that, um, and I guess it's derived from something that I think you have said a few times in the unscripted room, which is that, fear can be a good short-term strategy and respect can be a good long-term strategy.
Yeah.
And I think that helping to uplift other personalities and businesses and organizations around us is going to be an excellent strategy in the long term, but that um, it's the kind of thing that's going to have a delayed gratification, you
Right.
know?
Well, it's also only possible because I had built another side of our business that operates outside of this
Hmm.
that allows us to be able to have the leveraged position of not needing, to be traditional.
Yeah.
And without that, I might be falling into, if this was the only version of our business that we had, Oliver, and because what we're doing is all out, no in, and that has a very small shelf life
Right.
unless you have something else that balances that a little bit.
Yeah.
And then eventually you have to be able to weather the out no in for a certain amount of time. And then if you don't get to the point where it's more in than out, then you didn't build a good business.
Hmm.
You and I don't even think that you built a charity because, eventually that charity will need to go to somebody else and ask them for for resources. And where do those resources come from? Why did they get created? Why do you have them now?
Right.
All of those create long-term challenges where I think what every business needs, and this is probably not all that different than the conversation we had about parenting, is that businesses need to be nurtured and get unconditional love for a certain amount of time. They need somebody to just be absolutely obsessed with trying to build this thing, and then eventually you need to get it to the point where it needs to get some discipline.
Hmm.
And then once it has discipline, you need to be able to let go and and make sure that the people who are now participating in it are the ones who get to take ownership over what it becomes.
Yeah.
Because
That's
otherwise,
interesting.
you stifle it, and it ends up being this like singularly. It could have a singular shelf life rather than an abundant shelf life.
Right.
Although I will say the other day I was listening, over the weekend, I was doing deep dives on all different kinds of podcasts, just trying to figure out if I could see what people were doing and improve my skills. And um, I heard somebody talking about Kanye's comeback tour,
Hmm.
and they were describing what going to his concerts are like. And they basically were saying that this guy has taken complete creative control over giving a concert, and when he knows, like he'll find a venue that is available, like big venues, stadium kind of venues, and he'll figure out that they're sitting empty at a certain time, and then he'll negotiate the rental of of that space, and then in very short amount of time, like 2 weeks, will come in and set everything up that they need to, and then release the tickets, and he's selling out all of these crazy venues. None of this, I have no experience other than what this person told me in the
Hmm.
podcast, so I could be completely wrong on all of this. But they described it as being the most amazing creative experience they've ever witnessed.
I mean, it sounds, this is something that I um, think about a lot as someone who's interested in creating a creative business of my own one day, is that I think all art at the end of the day is an experience. And that especially if you want to make any money making your art, that you have to think about scalability. Like, how do I go from playing, getting paid a finite amount of money to go play a gig here, to how do I create an event that I can sell tickets to that everyone wants to be involved in?
For sure.
And it's a really interesting thing because when you're talking about an event, you're talking about a very immersive four-dimensional experience. There's so many factors. Um, I would imagine that it would be very easy to lose yourself in a positive way in the passion of that, and then that's the ultimate example of I think that there's two different kinds of great places that art comes from, which is when one person follows their vision in a completely uncompromising way and doesn't think about what the outcome is for the audience, or at least is true to that, is true to themselves, right? And then I think the other kind is where you bring together a team of experts and you allow them to each have their own place, and then there's usually still someone who directs and has a creative vision. But like, if we want to talk about Christopher Nolan, like Christopher Nolan wants to make a great movie, he goes straight to Hans Zimmer. He's like, I know we got to have you on this.
Yeah. I would be really surprised, other than maybe like a stand-up comedian, that there's very many art forms where a single individual person could take their creative endeavor from start to finish without.
Definitely music you can.
Yeah, music's another really good example. You're right. Yeah, so music, stand-up comedy.
Author, if you're a writer.
Yep. Yeah. Geez. Wow. That didn't take you long to break down.
Painter, poet. No, but in terms of big things,
but
right?
even all of those, like if we go back, and I don't mean to say this to be defensive in any way, but just like if you're an author, you still have to find somebody to publish your book.
True.
If you're an artist, you're still looking for Nina to show it in her gallery.
And even as a musician, right? Like I didn't if you're using if you're an artist, a musician, and you want to take your own thing from end to end,
Yeah.
the amount of tools that you're going to use that were invented by other people,
Yeah.
it's incredible. Like right now, I have Main Stage up. If we want to think about the amount of work other people did to create this podcast, shout out Ecamm. Wouldn't be possible without all the hard work that they did.
Yeah.
Whoever invented, like Apple, we're using a Mac here. We're using two Macs. We have these microphones. It's a tremendous amount of work actually over time. It's
Yes.
slightly different conversation at that point, but it's you could argue actually that you never do anything by yourself.
I think that would be the smart place to start the argument. And then there might be some ridiculous outliers where somebody has been able to do something extraordinary by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But it's way, way more likely that that you're in a better place if the expression of your art is 100% you.
Yeah.
So that anybody who experiences your art can feel you completely in whatever that experience is, but that you share that experience with people with such accuracy that they feel like they get to be a part of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That you're sharing it at that point. But very complicated to do. But one of the things that I have experienced personally is just that the more I set my sights on very, very difficult things, the more I find that I'm creating positive outcomes that I would have never thought of anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So you just, you try to, for us, the mission has always been to help people escape the prison of their own self-doubt through the pursuit of mastering themselves. That's like an impossible mission to hit
Right.
in the long run, right? But like the idea that we want to work towards trying to help as many people as we possibly can escape the prison of their own self-doubt through the pursuit of mastering themselves, that gives us so much opportunity to be able to be like, well, which decision should we make? What should our conversation principles look like? What, how do we, what's the relationship between escaping the prison of your own self-doubt and, what do you need to, what kind of self-confidence do you need to be able to make that escape?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of connections do you want to have with other people once you have felt that freedom? And then, what does sustaining that freedom look like? How does that all work into it? And it just opens you up to more detailed questions that you're going to have to answer to be able to get to that larger goal. And I've always just think that for everybody, I think we should be encouraging everyone to dream big as they can.
Yeah.
Maybe that's really how potential can be defined is by allowing yourself to figure out just how big you want to dream. Not everybody has to have the same ambition with their dream, but however much ambition you bring to your dream is probably likely what you're going to have to come to terms with yourself to find the skills and the potential to be able to achieve.
Yeah, 100%. And just on the subject of time, we are now at 3 hours and 5 minutes, which is incredible to think.
Okay, let's wrap it.
Yeah.
Good. I think we have a good solid mic check. I think my mic is working. I think your mic is working. I think we've got that figured out.
Well, Brett, now you have to move on to mic 2.
Oh, yeah. Well, all right, Oliver, this was fun. Good. I think that this is a cool thing. Let's keep going on Tuesdays.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
All right.